The night hung heavy over the streets, a thick, oppressive silence pressing down on the neighborhood like a suffocating blanket. The air was cool, tinged with the faint scent of gasoline and exhaust, and the occasional flicker of a street lamp cast jagged shadows across the cracked pavement. Officer Jake Miller gripped the steering wheel of his patrol car, his knuckles whitening as the vehicle prowled through the dimly lit roads. His jaw was set, his brow furrowed with a restless irritation that gnawed at him incessantly. Nearly 10 years on the force, and what did he have to show for it? Endless late-night shifts that blurred into one another, a marriage fraying at the seams, and a creeping sense of disrespect from the colleagues he once thought he'd impress. The world, in Jake's mind, had turned against him, and this neighborhood, its graffiti-smeared walls and flickering lights only fueled his bitterness. To him, it was a cesspool, a place where trouble festered, where people like them thrived in the shadows. His eyes caught on something ahead, a sleek black sedan parked at the lone gas station. Piercing the darkness, a woman stood beside it, her silhouette sharp against the faint glow of the pump's fluorescent light. Even from this distance, Jake could tell she was black, her posture steady as she handled the nozzle. Her uniform gleamed faintly, the polished fabric catching the light in a way that sparked something in him suspicion. Yes, but also a deeper, uglier impulse. A cop out here, at this hour. His mind raced, twisting the sight into something he could control, something he could challenge. His hand darted to the switch on his dashboard, flooding the gas station with the harsh, blinding glare of his patrol car's lights. The siren's wail ripped through the stillness, a jarring scream that startled the handful of late-night patrons lingering near the station's convenience store. Tires squealed as he swung into the lot with reckless force, the car lurching to a stop as if to announce his dominance over the scene. Captain Maya Harper froze for a split second, her hands still wrapped around the gas nozzle. The blinding lights reflected off her sedan's mirrors, stabbing into her eyes as she squinted toward the approaching vehicle. The sound of the siren was all too familiar. Years on the force had drilled it into her senses, but tonight it carried an edge of hostility that set her nerves alight. She straightened slowly, her movements deliberate, her instincts sharpening as the patrol car screeched to a halt just feet from her. The door flew open with a loud bang, and out stepped Jake, his boots hitting the pavement with a thud that echoed in the quiet. He slammed the door behind him, the force of it reverberating through the air, and his hand lingered near his utility belt, fingers brushing the holstered weapon in a way that wasn't quite a threat, but carried the weight of one. Under the gas station's buzzing fluorescent glow, his shadow stretched long and menacing across the concrete. "You," his voice cut through the night, sharp and commanding, dripping with an authority he seemed desperate to prove. What are you doing here?" Maya turned to face him fully, her motions slow and measured, her badge catching the light as it hung proudly on her chest. She didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch as she studied him. His tone burned with something more than routine suspicion. It was personal, a heat that sliced through her like a blade. She could feel it, the way his eyes raked over her, questioning her very presence, just filling up. She said at last, her voice steady, calm, a quiet anchor against his storm. Jake's gaze flicked to her uniform, then back to her face, his skepticism carving deep lines into his forehead. "Filling up, huh, at this hour, in this neighborhood?" His words were laced with a sneer, as if her explanation was a flimsy lie he could see right through. Maya raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching with the faintest hint of defiance. "Didn't know there were curfews for officers," she replied, her tone cool but edged with steel, a subtle challenge that made Jake's jaw tighten. Her words grated against him, her casual confidence a splinter under his skin. Who did she think she was, standing there so composed, so sure of herself? "Step away from the vehicle," he barked, his voice rising sharply enough to draw curious glances from the handful of onlookers. Near the station's entrance, Maya held his stare, her dark eyes unflinching, locking with his for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then, with a grace that spoke of years of discipline, she eased the gas nozzle back into its holder and stepped aside, her movement smooth and unhurried. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice still calm, but now carrying a faint undercurrent of curiosity, as if she were testing the waters of his intent. Jake didn't respond immediately. Instead, he began to circle her car, his boots crunching against the gritty pavement with every deliberate step. His eyes scanned the vehicle's spotless exterior, the neatly aligned terraces, if he could will some infraction into existence, some justification for the authority he'd thrust into this moment. "This area's seen a lot of crime lately," he said finally, his tone heavy with implication. "Suspicious activity, people who don't belong." Maya folded her arms, leaning lightly against the side of her sedan, her posture relaxed yet unyielding. "And you think I fit that description?" Her words were a quiet jab, piercing through the haze of his assumptions. Jake stopped short, turning to face her directly, his eyes narrowing into slits. "We'll see, ID." Now, her fingers twitched toward the badge dangling around her neck, a gleaming symbol of her rank and resilience. "This should be sufficient identification," she said, her voice firm but tinged with the barest hint of exasperation. Jake's hand brushed his belt again, a reflexive gesture that betrayed his unease. "The drill." He snapped, his tone clipped and impatient. Maya exhaled through her nose, a flicker of annoyance dancing across her features before she smoothed it away. With deliberate slowness, she reached into her pocket, retrieving her wallet under his watchful gaze. She handed over her ID without a word, her movements precise, controlled, a silent refusal to let him rattle her. Jake took it, his fingers brushing hers briefly as he snatched the card. He studied it far longer than necessary, his eyes lingering over her name, her rank captain, as if the word itself offended him, as if it didn't belong next to her face. He thrust it back at her, his posture stiff, unyielding. "Why are you here?" He pressed again, his voice a low growl. "I just told you," Maya replied evenly, slipping the ID back into her wallet. "I'm filling up my gas tank." Jake's eyes darted to her car, then to the small cluster of patrons huddled near the station's entrance, their murmurs barely audible over the hum of the pumps. His paranoia fed his frustration, twisting her presence into something sinister. "In a place like this, at this hour, strange choice, don't you think?" Maya's patience wore thin, though her voice remained a steady blade. "I've patrolled this area for years, officer. I know it well. I also know when someone's crossing a line." Jake's jaw clenched, her words echoing in his ears like an accusation. "Crossing a line," he repeated, his voice low and tight, barely containing the anger simmering beneath. "I'm doing my job, protecting this neighborhood." "From what, exactly?" Maya shot back, her tone sharp enough to slice through his bravado. The question hung between them, heavy and unanswered, a challenge he couldn't quite meet. Jake shifted his weight, his fingers twitching at his sides, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. The air grew thick with it, drawing uneasy glances from the bystanders, who now watched more openly, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding drama. Jake broke the silence with a short, humorless laugh, a sound that grated against the night. "Step back. I need to take a look at your vehicle." Maya straightened, stepping forward instead of back, her presence a quiet but unyielding force. "You have no probable cause, officer," she said firmly, her words carrying the weight of someone who'd faced down worse than him and come out standing. "I'll decide what I need," Jake snapped, his voice rising again, a desperate bid to reclaim control. "Now step away." Her heart rate quickened, a steady drumbeat beneath her ribs, but she refused to let it show. "Not without a reason," she said, her voice resolute, forged in the fires of countless battles like this one. Jake's nostrils flared, his control slipping through his fingers like sand. He could feel the situation spiraling, his authority challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. But instead of backing down, he doubled down, his voice a low growl. "Are you refusing to comply?" Maya tilted her head, her gaze unflinching, piercing through the haze of his anger. "I'm refusing to be intimidated by someone abusing their authority." Jake's eyes blazed, his fists curling at his sides, the fury building inside him like a storm about to break. For a moment, it seemed he might snap, might let that rage spill over into something irreversible. But then a sharp slam cut through the tension, the sound of a car door nearby. A bystander, a weary man in a faded jacket, stepped out of his vehicle, his phone raised high. "Hey," he called, his voice rough with indignation. "What's going on here?" Jake whirled toward him, his expression darkening. A predator interrupted mid-hunt. Maya remained still, her eyes fixed on Jake, unwavering, a pillar of strength in the chaos. The balance of power had shifted, if only slightly. The bystander's presence a crack in Jake's facade. But the confrontation was far from over. As the man began recording, the faint red light of his camera blinking in the dark, Jake's frustration boiled closer to the surface, his breaths coming in short, angry bursts. Maya stood steady, resolute, her mind flickering briefly to the path that had brought her here. That familiar sensation, defiance tempered with resolve, settled into her bones, as natural as breathing. His tone, his stance, the way he wielded his badge like a weapon, it echoed countless moments from her past. A career built on fighting battles both loud and silent. She thought of her early days, a fresh recruit stepping into a world that didn't want her. A precinct filled with white men who saw her as a token, a box to check. The sneers in the locker room, the muttered slurs disguised as jokes, the assignments she was subtly excluded from, they'd all cut deep. But she'd never let them see her bleed. She remembered one trainer, a grizzled veteran named Harper. No relation would smirked at her during a training drill. "You sure you can handle this, Harper? You don't exactly fit the mold." His words weren't blatant, but the undertone was a knife to her gut, questioning not her ability, but her right to exist in that space. She'd clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms, and met his gaze. "Watch me," she'd said, her voice steady despite the fire roaring inside her. And she had trained harder, studied longer, pushed herself beyond what anyone expected. Every doubter became fuel, every slight a stepping stone. Her first major arrest, a dangerous gang takedown, had been hers alone. Months of undercover work unraveling a web of violence. Yet her captain, at the time, had brushed it off as a team effort, his praise reserved for the men who'd swooped in at the end. And then there was that night at a department party, a senior officer swaying with drink, leaning too close. "You've done well, Harper. Surprising, really. Didn't think someone like you could handle the pressure." His grin had widened as she'd stepped back, her voice cutting through his haze. "Someone like me." The humiliation had burned, but she'd turned it into steel. Now, facing Jake, she saw it all again, the same arrogance, the same misuse of power. But she also saw the lesson etched into every encounter. Justice wasn't just a badge or a title. It was a fight, a stand against those who wielded their authority like a club. Jake's anger, his desperation to dominate, would be his undoing, captured now for the world to see. And as the bystander's camera rolled, Maya braced herself for what came next. Knowing this clash was bigger than just the two of them, it was a mirror to the consequences of unchecked power. A testament to the strength it took to hold the line. The sting of those words from years past had seared themselves into Maya Harper's memory, a branding iron pressed deep into her soul. Yet, rather than crumbling beneath their weight, she had felt a spark catch within her, a fierce, unyielding flame that refused to be extinguished, standing in the dim glow of her childhood bedroom all those years ago, her fists clenched and her jaw tight. She had made a silent vow to herself. Never again would she allow such venomous remarks to shape who she was or dictate the heights she could climb. That promise became the bedrock of her life, a quiet mantra pulsing through her veins as she carved her path forward. By the time she earned the rank of sergeant, her name carried a weight of its own, whispered in precinct hallways not just with skepticism, but with a grudging respect. Her tenacity was a force, her excellence undeniable. And though some critics began to quiet their sneers, others lingered in the shadows, their doubts festering like weeds in cracked pavement. The day she pinned on her captain's Barca milestone so rare, it felt like a defiance of gravity itself, especially for a black woman. There around her shifted. She could still feel the weight of that moment, the crisp press of her uniform against her skin, the gleam of the badge catching the light as she stood before her new office door. Her colleagues, though, were swift to sharpen their knives' optics. One had muttered under his breath as she passed by in the corridor, the word dripping with disdain. "Diversity hire." Another hissed, low enough to pretend it wasn't meant for her ears. She'd heard it all, felt the sting like a slap across her face, but she didn't falter. Instead, she strode into her office, the faint creak of the door behind her a quiet victory, and settled into her chair. The desk was hers now, hard-won, and she buried herself in the work, each file she signed, each order she gave, a brick laid in the fortress of her legacy. Maya's rise wasn't forged in a single blaze of glory, but in the slow, steady grind of countless triumphs, bridges she built over rivers of doubt, armor she forged from every slight thrown her way. Beneath that steel, though, the echoes of her struggles lingered, a quiet ache she carried in her chest. Now, standing at the gas station under the flickering fluorescent lights, those memories surged back, crashing over her like a tide. The nozzle clicked in her hand as fuel hissed into her tank, but her mind was elsewhere, reeling through years spent proving herself to a system that seemed hell-bent on grinding her down. And here it was again, that same old fight, only this time it wore the face of Officer Jake Miller. His voice sliced through the night air, sharp and jagged, pulling her back to the present. "What's with the attitude, Harper?" He spat, her name twisted into a mockery on his tongue. His eyes, narrowed and glinting with suspicion, raked over her uniform as if it were an insult to him. "You think wearing that makes you untouchable?" Maya's breath caught for a moment, her heart thudding against her ribs, but she lifted her chin and met his gaze head-on. Her voice, when it came, was steady as stone, though inside she felt the familiar storm brewing. "I think it means I understand the law better than most," she said, each word measured and deliberate. "And I know you're out of line." He took a step closer, his boots scuffing the cracked concrete, his broad frame looming over her like a shadow meant to intimidate. "Out of line," he sneered, his tone thick with contempt. "Don't start preaching to me about rules. People like you think you can just. People like me," Maya cut in, her voice a blade slicing through his tirade. Her eyes flashed with a fire she'd kept banked for years, now roaring to life. "What exactly does that mean, Officer Miller?" For a fleeting second, Jake Faltretta's mouth twitched, uncertainty flickering in his gaze as her words hung heavy between them. But the hesitation drowned quickly under a wave of anger, his face hardening into something uglier. "It means you don't belong here," he growled, his voice dropping low, each syllable a punch aimed at her core. The words landed hard, not because they shocked her, they didn't, but because they were so achingly familiar. Echoes of a chorus she'd heard her whole life. Yet this time, something shifted inside her. She wasn't the rookie anymore, trembling under the weight of her first uniform. She wasn't the young woman biting her tongue to keep the peace. She was Captain Maya Harper, a title she'd clawed her way to through blood and grit. And she'd be damned if she let this man strip it from her. Taking a slow, deliberate step forward, she erased the space he'd tried to claim. "I've spent my entire career proving people like you wrong," she said, her voice a quiet thunder, brimming with a strength that made the air crackle. "So if you think for 1 second your ignorance is going to intimidate me, you're mistaken." Jake stiffened, his hand twitching toward his belt, not out of fear, but out of habit, a reflex to reassert the control he craved. Before he could spit another word, a new voice pierced the tension, sharp and unexpected. "Hey, what's the problem here?" A man stepped closer, his phone held aloft, its camera lens glinting in the dim light as it captured the scene. His brow furrowed with concern, his stance wary but resolute. "This doesn't look right." Jake's head snapped toward him, irritation flaring across his features like a struck match. "Stay out of this," he barked, his voice ragged with desperation. A man clinging to a fraying thread of authority. Maya didn't flinch, didn't shift her gaze from Jake. Her silence was a weapon, honed over years of battles just like this one. She knew his type, men who underestimated her, who saw her as a threat to their fragile egos. The man with the phone pressed forward, undeterred. "Seems like you're harassing her," he said, his tone firm, his eyes flicking between them. "She's a cop, right? So what's the deal?" Jake's posture grew rigid, his jaw clenching so tight she could almost hear his teeth grind. But Maya saw it, then the fissures in his bravado, the cracks widening with every challenge he couldn't silence. He wasn't used to this, to being questioned by someone who refused to shrink under his glare. The air thickened with tension, a storm brewing under the gas station's flickering lights. Maya drew a slow breath, steadying the pulse hammering in her chest. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every step she'd taken to get here. Every barrier she'd shattered, every doubter she'd left in her wake. Justice wasn't just a word to her, It was a lifeline, a principle she'd fought to uphold in a world that too often bent it to favor the powerful. Jake's abuse of his badge, his petty tyranny, was a mirror of the forces she'd battled her whole career, men who wielded authority like a club, oblivious to the wreckage they left behind. Straightening her shoulders, she stood taller, her resolve a steel spine forged in fire. She'd faced worse than Jake Miller before, and she'd face worse again. But tonight, under the watchful eye of a stranger's camera, she wouldn't back down. Across the lot, Jake Miller sat hunched in his patrol car, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched white. The engine's low hum vibrated through the seat, a steady pulse that did nothing to calm the tempest raging inside him. Through the windshield, he watched Maya Harper at the pump, her every move stoking the resentment that churned in his gut. The way she stood, shoulders back, head high, her badge catching the light, was a taunt, a silent rebuke to everything he'd failed to become. 10 years he'd worn the uniform, 10 years of grinding through midnight shifts in forgotten corners of the city, neighborhoods where the streetlights flickered and the air smelled of despair. 10 years, and what did he have? A stack of rejection letters, a career stalled in the mud, while others, people he deemed unworthy, climbed past him. His colleagues had risen, their names spoken with nods of approval, while he remained a ghost in the ranks, passed over again and again. Each no from a superior, each promotion slipped through his fingers, burned into him like a brand, a constant reminder of his stagnation. But Jake didn't look inward. He didn't see the late nights he'd spent nursing grudges instead of reports, or the complaints piling up from citizens he'd dismissed with a sneer. No, the fault lay elsewhere, in the system, in the politics, in the quotas that propped up people like her. His father's voice echoed in his skull, a gravelly sermon he'd heard since he was old enough to listen. Don't trust them, Jake. They don't respect authority. They'll smile to your face and stab you in the back. Those words, steeped in bitterness and distrust, had rooted deep, shaping the lens through which he viewed the world, especially anyone who didn't mirror his own reflection. Seeing Maya, a black woman draped in the authority he'd never grasped, lit something primal in him. She was everything he despised, a symbol of a system he blamed for his own failures, a living contradiction to the worldview he clung to. He told himself it wasn't envy, that his contempt was reasoned, justified. But beneath the surface, doubt gnawed, a quiet, nagging whisper he smothered with anger. Without a second thought, he flipped on the siren, its wail tearing through the stillness of the night. Tires squealed as he swung into the gas station, his movements sharp and aggressive. A bull charging into the ring. If anyone noticed the fury in his stride as he stepped out, he didn't care. Adjusting his belt, his hand lingered near his holster, not because he felt danger, but because it was power, a signal of who he thought he should be. Step away from the vehicle, he barked, his voice honed to a razor's edge over years of commanding compliance. She turned, her gaze locking onto his with a calm that set his nerves ablaze. I'm just pumping gas, she said, her tone even, devoid of the deference he expected. His eyes narrowed, irritation prickling under his skin. In this neighborhood, at this hour, her brow arched, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of amusement in her ice's spark. That made his blood boil. Didn't realize there were restrictions on where officers could refuel, she replied, her words smooth but edged with steel. His chest tightened, frustration coiling like a spring. ID, he snapped, his tone a whip crack in the night air. She gestured to her badge, its shine a quiet defiance. This should suffice, she said, firm but unruffled. Identification, he demanded louder. Refusing to yield, she reached into her pocket with deliberate calm, handing him the card. His eyes scanned at Captain Maya Harper, and the title hit him like a slap, mocking his every assumption. He shoved it back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. So, Captain, what brings you out here? She crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. Filling up my gas tank. Why? Her composure, her refusal to bend, snapped something inside him. She wasn't explaining herself, wasn't bowing to his authority. Instead, she studied him, her gaze piercing, as if she were the one holding the reins. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. This area isn't exactly safe, Captain. Lots of crime, people who don't belong. She didn't flinch, didn't blink, just tilted her head, her eyes sharp as a blade. "And who decides who belongs, Officer Miller?" The question struck him like a blow, rattling the foundation of his certainty. For a heartbeat, doubt crept in, cold and unwelcome, but he buried it beneath a surge of rage. "I decide when something looks suspicious," he shot back, his voice rising. "And right now, this doesn't look right." Her expression hardened, a subtle shift that carried the weight of years. "What exactly doesn't look right, officer?" she asked, her tone pointed, daring him to say it. He leaned in, his presence a wall of aggression. "Do I need to explain myself to you?" Her answer came swift and unflinching. "Yes," she said, her voice steady but cutting. "You do. That's how the law works." His fists clenched at his sides, her defiance a match to his tinder. She was challenging him, stripping away the respect he demanded, and he couldn't let it stand. "Step away from the car," he ordered again, his words ice cold. She didn't budge. "Not without cause," she replied, her jaw tight, her eyes locked on his. Jake's patience shattered. "Are you refusing to comply?" Her gaze didn't waver. "I'm refusing to be intimidated by someone abusing their position." The accusation hit him hard, his hand jerking toward his belt as his anger threatened to spill over. Before he could act, a voice broke through the haze. "Hey, what's going on here?" The man with the phone stepped closer, his camera steady, his presence a sudden wrench in Jake's crumbling control. Jake's story was a cautionary tale, a man undone by his own bitterness. His abuse of power wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was the inevitable fruit of a life spent blaming others for his failures. Maya, though, stood as a testament to justice's slow but unrelenting march. Her victories weren't loud, but they were profound. A reminder that authority misused would always meet its reckoning. The air at the gas station hung heavy with tension, thick and oppressive, as Jake Miller's boots scuffed against the cracked pavement. His sharp turn was sudden, almost involuntary, his gaze snapping toward a figure in the distance, a man clutching a phone, its camera lens catching the faint glow of the overhead lights. The bystander edged closer, his steps deliberate, his voice rising above the hum of idling engines. "Why are you harassing her?" he demanded, each word laced with accusation. Jake's jaw clenched, his breath catching in his chest as he fired back. "I'm not harassing anyone." But the tremor in his tone betrayed him, a flicker of unease rippling beneath his bravado. The man didn't retreat. Instead, he stood his ground, shoulders squared, his phone held steady like a weapon of truth. "She's a cop, right? So what's your problem?" Jake felt the weight of those words settle over him, a suffocating pressure that squeezed his lungs. The camera's unblinking eye bore into him, stripping away the armor of his authority, unraveling the control he clung to so fiercely. His chest tightened, his pulse thudding in his ears as the situation slipped further from his grasp. He wheeled back toward Maya Harper, his voice dropping into a low, guttural growl. Thick with frustration, "This isn't over." Her eyes met his, unflinching, a quiet storm brewing in their depths. "No," she replied, her voice steady as stone, unshaken by his aggression. "It's not." The bystander's phone kept rolling, capturing every second, and Jake's simmering rage teetered on the edge of explosion, setting the stage for a clash that promised to spiral beyond anyone's control. Jake Miller was unraveling, his temper a frayed thread snapping with each step he took toward Maya's vehicle. The night air was cool, but sweat beaded on his forehead as he ignored the ID she'd already shown him, the badge pinned proudly to her uniform glinting under the fluorescent glow of the gas station canopy. His flashlight trembled slightly in his grip as he thrust it toward her window, the beam slicing through the darkness to land squarely on her face. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, her calm defiance stoking the fire in his gut. "Roll the window down," he barked, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade, sharp and unyielding. Inside the car, Maya tilted her head, her movements slow and deliberate, her expression a mask of composure that only deepened his irritation. "I've already provided identification," she said evenly, her tone measured but firm. "Is there a specific reason you're escalating this, Officer Miller?" He didn't answer. Words felt useless, inadequate against the rising tide of his frustration. Instead, he rapped the end of his flashlight against the glass hard. The sharp crack echoed through the lot, A jolt that drew curious glances from the handful of patrons lingering near the pumps. Their whispers buzzed faintly in the background, a chorus of unease. "Step out of the car," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Inside, Maya's jaw tightened, a subtle shift that betrayed the calculations running through her mind. Years on the force had taught her the bitter truth. Confrontations like this rarely cooled without pushback. With a slow, deliberate grace, she reached for the door handle, her fingers steady as she pushed it open and stepped out into the night. Her posture was a study in control, shoulders back, head high, but her eyes locked onto his with a precision that felt like a challenge. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" Jake took a step back, only to surge forward again, closing the distance between them until he loomed over her, his shadow swallowing the space. His hand hovered near the baton at his belt, fingers twitching with restless energy. "I don't like being questioned, Harper," he snapped, his voice dripping with menace. "Step away from the vehicle." Maya didn't budge, her boots planted firmly on the asphalt. "You're overstepping," she said, her words cutting through the haze of his anger. "And we both know it. This isn't standard procedure." That edge in her voice had scraped against his nerves, raw and unrelenting. He wasn't accustomed to this, to being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as beneath him. The bystander's camera loomed larger in his mind, its lens a relentless judge amplifying his desperation to dominate. "Step away," he repeated, each syllable clipped and taut. Maya exhaled, a slow release of breath that carried her resolve. She took a single step back, but her stance remained unyielding, her gaze never wavering. "I've complied enough," she said, her voice steady as iron. "Now tell me why you're here." Jake's eyes darted over her car, predatory and restless, searching for anything to justify his actions. Without warning, he yanked his baton free from its holster and brought it down against the hood with a resounding clang. The metallic sound sliced through the night, sharp and jarring, a declaration of his fraying control. "What are you doing?" Maya's voice was calm, but beneath it ran a current of authority, a quiet power that refused to bend. Jake didn't respond. He moved to the driver's side, raising the baton again and striking the wind down it hard enough to shatter it, but enough to send a tremor through the frame, a warning of his intent. "Pop the trunk," he ordered, his voice tight with barely contained fury. Maya's eyes narrowed, her composure unshaken. "You have no probable cause for a search." His lips twisted into a thin, humorless smile, a flicker of defiance in his expression. "I'll decide what's probable cause," he shot back. "Then you'd better be ready to justify that to internal affairs," she countered, her words swift and piercing. Jake bristled, his frustration boiling over, a molten heat that threatened to consume him. He was losing the narrative, losing the power he craved, and he knew it. But instead of retreating, he doubled down, stepping closer, the baton still clutched in his hand. "Pop the trunk," he repeated, each word enunciated with exaggerated precision, as if daring her to defy him again. Maya crossed her arms, her posture a wall of resistance. Not without a warrant. Jake advanced, the baton swinging loosely at his side, his voice rising. "Are you refusing to comply with a lawful order, an unlawful order?" she corrected, her tone razor-sharp, cutting through his bluster with surgical precision. The air between them crackled, charged with the weight of their standoff. Nearby, a few patrons exchanged hushed words, their eyes flickering between the two officers, uncertainty etched into their faces. The bystander with the phone edged closer, tilting the device to frame both their profiles in its lens. Jake caught the movement from the corner of his eye, and his frustration erupted into a reckless impulse. "You think you're above this because of that badge?" he sneered, his voice thick with contempt. "You think your rank makes you untouchable?" Maya's gaze held steady, a lighthouse in the storm of his rage. "I think my badge represents the law, Officer Miller," she said, her words deliberate and heavy with meaning. "And right now, you're not upholding it, you are abusing it." Her accusation struck him like a physical blow, his hand tightening around the baton until his knuckles gleamed white under the gas station lights. For a fleeting moment, he imagined smashing it against the car again, shattering the silence, silencing her defiance. But the camarade ever-present witness held him in check, its gaze a leash on his impulses. He stepped back, his voice rising to a shout that echoed across the lot. "I need to search the vehicle for contraband. Step aside." Maya planted her feet, immovable as granite. "If you want to search this vehicle, you'll need more than intimidation tactics." The bystander's voice cut through the tension, loud and clear. A bold interruption that drew Jake's ire. "Is this how you treat one of your own?" Jake's head whipped toward the man, his eyes blazing with fury. "Stay out of this," he snarled, his voice a guttural roar. But the man didn't flinch, his stance firm, his phone unwavering. "Seems like you're the one stepping out of line here," he said, his tone steady and unafraid. "She's in uniform. What more do you need?" Jake's frustration was a living thing now, a beast clawing at his chest, suffocating him with its intensity. The weight of the camera, the murmurs of the growing crowd, and Maya's unshakable resolve pressed down on him, crushing his sense of control. "Fine," he spat, venom dripping from the word. "If you won't comply, I'll call for backup. Let's see how this plays out when we've got more eyes on the scene." Maya's expression didn't shift, her calm a stark contrast to his unraveling. "Go ahead," she said simply, her voice a quiet challenge. "Let's see how your superiors feel about this." Jake froze, his next move suspended in the air like a held breath. His pride screamed at him to push harder, to force her into submission, to reclaim the dominance he felt slipping away. But the bystander's phone, its lens a silent judge, and Maya's unflinching composure gnawed at his resolve. The tension between them was a tangible force, thick and unyielding. The gas station falling into a hush broken only by the faint buzz of the lights overhead. The crowd watched, breath bated, as Jake's internal war played out in the clench of his jaw, the twitch of his fingers. His next choice would tip the scales toward escalation, or retreat, and Maya could see the storm raging behind his eyes. But she stood firm, a pillar of justice, certain of one unshakable truth: she would not yield. The moment stretched, taut and fragile, until Jake's patience snapped like a brittle twig. His jaw locked tight as he lunged for the driver's side door, yanking it open with a force that sent the hinges squealing in protest. The sound pierced the silence, a jagged note that reverberated through the lot. Maya stepped forward, her voice sharp and unyielding. "What exactly are you looking for, Officer Miller? Or is this just an exercise in harassment?" He didn't look at her, didn't dignify her with a response. "Contraband," he muttered, the word tossed out like an afterthought as he leaned into the car, his hands moving with a frantic purpose that belied his lack of reason. Drugs, weapons, anything, he didn't care what, so long as it justified his actions, restored his power. Without hesitation, he tore open the glove compartment, its contents spilling out in a chaotic cascade. A neatly folded map unfurled across the seat, a pack of tissues fluttered to the floor, and a small notepad landed with a soft thud. Jake seized them one by one, rifling through the pages, flipping the map upside down, tearing open the tissue pack as if it might conceal some hidden sin. His movements were feverish, desperate, a man grasping at straws. "This is beyond unacceptable." Maya snapped, her voice rising like a blade through the fog of his obsession. She stepped closer, her presence a quiet thunder. "You're violating every protocol. Step away from my vehicle immediately." Jake ignored her, his focus narrowing as he stormed to the passenger side. He wrenched the door open with a violence that sent it banging against its frame. The sound of gunshot in the stillness. Heads turned more now than before. A mother near the station's entrance froze, her arm tightening around her young son as she watched, wide-eyed, caught between fear and fascination. A cluster of bystanders murmured, their curiosity souring into discomfort as Jake dug through the passenger storage. His hands shoved aside a stack of papers, a bottle of water tumbling to the pavement with a dull clatter. He barely glanced at it before tossing a small bag aside, its zipper splitting under the force, spilling a few pens and a cane onto the ground. Maya advanced, her voice a command that cut through the chaos. "Miller," she barked, her tone ringing with the authority of someone who knew the law and lived it. "You're crossing a line. Call your supervisor right now. This stops here." Jake straightened, his eyes blazing as he spun to face her, his chest heaving with the weight of his fury. "Back off, Harper," he growled, the warning a low rumble in his throat. But she didn't retreat. "No," she said, stepping closer, her voice sharp and unrelenting. "You have no cause, no warrant. You're not just breaking protocol, you're breaking the law." The gas station seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with the consequences of his actions. The mother pulled her son closer, whispering something soft and urgent as she edged toward the safety of the building. The bystander with the phone shifted his angle, his hands steady despite the rising tension. His presence a quiet defiance that Jake couldn't ignore. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a ripple of judgment that pressed against him, amplifying the lesson unfolding in real time. Power, when abused, invited its own reckoning. Jake's hands trembled, the baton still gripped tightly, as he stood on the precipice of a choice that would define him, whether he doubled down into ruin or stepped back from the abyss. Maya watched, her resolve a mirror reflecting his unraveling, a silent testament to the justice that waited in the wings. The air at the gas station crackled with tension, thick and heavy, as Jake Miller's frustration surged like a storm ready to break. His chest heaved with every ragged breath, his face flushed with a volatile mix of anger and defiance. He took a deliberate step forward, his boots scuffing the cracked pavement, and with a sudden, forceful shove, he sent Maya Harper stumbling backward. Her heels scraped against the rough ground, a sharp, grating sound that cut through the stillness. She flailed for a moment, arms outstretched, fighting to regain her footing as her heart pounded with a jolt of adrenaline. For an instant, the world seemed to pause, every onlooker frozen. Every sound muffled until Maya steadied herself, her stance firm once more. Nearby, a bystander gripped his phone tighter, his knuckles whitening as he edged closer, the camera lens homing in on the unfolding chaos. His breath quickened with a mix of excitement and outrage. "You see that?" he yelled, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade, raw and unsteady. He just shoved Herthat's assault, plain as day. The words hung in the air, a challenge to anyone who dared ignore them. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of capturing something undeniable, something that could shift the tide. Maya straightened fully, her face a fortress of resolve. Though her pulse thrummed with a quiet fury, she kept tightly reined. Her dark eyes locked onto Jake's, unyielding, piercing through his bravado. She could feel the sting of the shove still radiating through her shoulders, but she refused to let it show. "That," she said, her voice low and steady, simmering with controlled wrath, "was your last mistake." The words weren't loud, but they carried a gravity that seemed to press down on Jake, a warning wrapped in certainty. Jake's nostrils flared, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles turned pale. He stood there, trembling with the effort to hold himself together, the heat of the moment clawing at his composure. The bystander's camera felt like a spotlight searing into him, and the growing cluster of onlookers, gas station patrons, a cashier peering from the doorway, a truck driver leaning against his rigwatch with eyes that judged without speaking. Their silent scrutiny bore down on him, a weight he couldn't shake. Yet instead of retreating, he doubled down, his pride a stubborn shield. "Pop the trunk," he barked, his tone stiff and unyielding, as if the command could reclaim his slipping authority. Maya didn't flinch. "Not a chance," she replied, planting herself firmly between him and her car. Her voice was calm, but it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through his bluster. She could sense the crowd shifting, their murmurs growing louder, their unease palpable. Jake's eyes narrowed, and with a sudden, furious motion, he swung his baton down against the trunk's edge. The metallic clang echoed through the station, a jarring sound that made the cashier flinch and the truck driver straighten up. "I'll open it myself," he growled, his voice thick with defiance. "You'll do no such thing," Maya shot back, her words swift and precise, slicing through his aggression like a blade through cloth. "This is unlawful. Every second you keep this up, you're burying yourself deeper." Her heart raced, not from fear but from the clarity of the stake. Knew the law, knew her rights, and she could see Jake unraveling before her. He didn't care. Reason had abandoned him, replaced by a reckless need to prove anything. Ignoring her, he leaned into the driver's side of her car, fumbling for the trunk release. His fingers shook slightly as he found it, and with a mechanical groan, the hatch sprang open. The sound grated on Maya's nerves, snapping the last thread of her patience. She surged forward, her movements swift and deliberate, positioning herself between Jake and the trunk. "Enough," she shouted, her voice rising above the growing hum of the crowd. It wasn't just a command, it was a line drawn in the sand. "Step back right now, or I'll call internal affairs myself." Jake's face hardened, his jaw tightening until it ached. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. Had he gone too far? But his pride wouldn't let him stop. He reached around her, his arm brushing against her shoulder, and grabbed at the trunk's contents. A first aid kit tumbled out, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. A flashlight followed, rolling lazily until it bumped against his boot. He snatched up the kit, his movements jerky and frantic, unzipping it as if he might uncover some hidden contraband to justify his actions. Bandages spilled out, antiseptic wipes fluttering to the ground, and with each useless item, his desperation grew more frantic. Maya watched him, her arms crossed, her stance unwavering. "You found nothing because there's nothing to find," she said, her voice cutting through his frenzied rummaging. "This ends now. Step aside." Her words were a lifeline he refused to take, a chance to walk away with some shred of dignity. Jake's voice cracked as he bellowed. No, his chest heaved, his eyes wild with a mix of rage and panic. He couldn't back down, not with the camera rolling, not with the crowd watching. But Maya stood firm, her feet rooted to the ground. "You're done here," she said, her tone final, leaving no room for argument. The crowd rippled with unease, their whispers swelling into a low rumble. The bystander with the phone stepped closer, emboldened by Maya's resolve. "This is all on camera, man," he called out, his voice rising with a mix of triumph and warning. "You're gonna lose your badge for this." His hands were steadier now, the phone a weapon he wielded with purpose. He could already imagine the footage spreading department desks, newsrooms, social media feeds, each view stripping Jake's authority bare. Jake whirled toward him, his face a mask of fury. "Put that phone away," he snapped, his voice trembling with the strain of holding onto control. "Not a chance," the man fired back, unflinching. "This is going straight to the department, maybe even the press." His defiance was a spark, threatening to ignite the tension into something explosive. Jake's grip on the first aid kit faltered, and it slipped from his hands, landing with a soft clatter on the pavement. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, his hands twitching as he fought to steady himself. The camera's unblinking eye, the crowd's growing disapproval, Maya's unshakable presence, sight was all closing in, suffocating him. He wasn't ready to surrender. "Though, this isn't over," he muttered, venom dripping from every syllable. "No," Maya replied, her voice steady as steel. "It's not. But you are." Her words landed like a gavel, a judgment he couldn't escape. Jake's face twisted into a grimace of anger and humiliation, his eyes darting between Maya and the onlookers. The pressure was a vice tightening around him, and for the first time, a flicker of realization pierced his bravado. He might not come out of this unscathed. The tension thickened, the gas station bathed in the harsh glow of overhead lights, casting long shadows across the pavement. Jake's frustration boiled just beneath the surface, a kettle ready to scream. The bystander's phone kept rolling, its lens a silent witness to every misstep. But the confrontation took an unexpected turn when a new voice, firm, commanding, and laced with familiarity, cut through the chaos like a lifeline thrown into a storm. "Jake Miller, what the hell do you think you're doing?" The words came from Tom Carter, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepping into the fray. His boots crunched against the gravel as he strode forward, his own phone raised, its camera trained on Jake with unwavering focus. Tom was no stranger to Maya, a local resident and longtime acquaintance. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen enough to know when to step in. His graying hair caught the light, and his weathered face was set in a hard line, his hazel eyes burning with indignation. Jake's head snapped toward the sound, his scowl deepening into something feral. "This isn't your business, Carter," he spat, irritation crackling in his voice. But Tom didn't waver. Ignoring Jake, he turned to Maya, his tone softening but still loud enough to carry to the crowd. "Captain Harper, you okay?" Maya gave a slight nod, her calm exterior a stark contrast to the storm brewing around her. "I'm fine, Tom," she said, though the edge in her voice betrayed the frustration simmering beneath her composure. She appreciated his concern, felt it like a steadying hand on her shoulder. But she didn't need rescuing, she needed this to end. Tom shifted his gaze back to Jake, his expression hardening into something unyielding. "Do you even know who you're messing with?" he demanded, his voice rising with righteous anger. "This is Captain Maya Harperoni of the highest-ranking officers in the department, and you're out here treating her like some damn criminal." His words were a thunderclap, reverberating through the station, and the crowd stirred, their murmurs growing into a chorus of agreement. Jake's jaw tightened until it felt like it might snap, his fists clenching at his sides. "Stay out of this, Tom," he said through gritted teeth, each word a struggle to maintain his crumbling facade. "This is official business." "Official business," Tom retorted, his voice climbing with incredulity. "This is harassment. Plain and simple. And guess what, Jake? It's all on camera." The words struck like a hammer, and Jake's eyes darted to the phone in Tom's hand, his discomfort visible in the stiffening of his shoulders, the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. But instead of retreating, he leaned into his pride, refusing to let it crack. "You think waving that phone around is gonna intimidate me?" he sneered, taking a menacing step toward Tom. "You have no idea what's going on here. So why don't you back off?" Tom didn't budge, his stance solid as stone. "I know exactly what's going on," he shot back, his voice steady and unflinching. "You're abusing your power because you think you can get away with it. Not this time." His eyes narrowed, daring Jake to push further, the phone in his hand a silent promise of accountability. Jake's face darkened, his frustration spilling into aggression. He jabbed his baton toward Tom, his voice rising to a near shout. "I said back off, or I'll arrest you for obstruction." The crowd gasped, a wave of alarm rippling through them as the two men squared off, the air between them electric with hostility. Maya stepped forward, her presence cutting through the noise like a beacon. "Enough, both of you." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd commanded rooms and silenced chaos before. Both men froze, their eyes snapping to her, caught in the gravity of her authority. She turned to Jake, her gaze sharp as a blade. "Officer Miller, you're out of line," she said, her words precise and unyielding. "This man has every right to record what's happening here, and unless you want that footage sent straight to internal affairs, I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Jake's nostrils flared, his grip tightening on his baton until his knuckles ached. For a moment, he looked ready to explode, to lash out and shatter the fragile restraint holding him back. But the weight of the camerastums, the bystanders and the crowd's watchful eyes pinned him in place. Tom took a step closer, his phone still aimed at Jake, his voice low and firm. "You hearing that, Miller? You've already crossed a line. Don't make it worse for yourself." Jake whirled back to Tom, his frustration boiling over. "I'm doing my job," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain, a plea masquerading as defiance. "Your job," Tom shot back, incredulous. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to bully and intimidate." Maya stepped between them, her posture radiating control, a calm anchor in the storm. "Jake, you need to stop," she said, her voice firm but measured, each word deliberate. "This isn't just about me. This is about the department, about accountability. Every move you make is being documented. Think about the consequences." Her eyes bore into his, searching for some flicker of reason beneath the rage. Jake hesitated, his breath hitching as his eyes flicked between Maya and Tom. The weight of her words, combined with the relentless gaze of the cameras, chipped away at his resolve. He could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the certainty he'd clung to slipping away. But instead of surrendering, he redirected his anger, turning back to Maya's car with a snarl. "This isn't over," he muttered, yanking open the back door with a force that made the hinges creak. "What the hell are you doing now?" Tom demanded, moving to follow, his phone still recording every reckless move. Jake ignored him, rifling through the seats with frantic energy. Papers fluttered to the ground, a water bottle rolled under the car, and the sound of objects hitting the pavement echoed through the station. Each thud was a testament to his unraveling, a man grasping at straws to reclaim control. Tom's voice rose above the noise, sharp and unwavering. "This is harassment, plain and simple. You're not going to find anything because there's nothing to find." The crowd nodded, their unease morphing into quiet outrage as they watched Jake's descent. He didn't respond, his frustration boiling over into wild, reckless actions. He reached into the trunk again, tossing aside the flashlight and first aid kit with erratic force. The items skittered across the pavement, the flashlight spinning in lazy circles, the kit spilling its contents like a confession of futility. Maya moved closer, her voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. "Miller, you've gone far enough. Step back." Jake froze, his hand gripping the trunk's edge so hard his fingers ached. He turned to face her, his expression a tangled mess of anger and desperation. "I'm doing my job," he said again, but the words sounded hollow, stripped of the conviction they'd once held. "No," Maya replied, her voice sharp and resolute. "You're abusing your position, and you're doing it in front of witnesses." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices a low hum of support, their presence a wall Jake couldn't breach. Tom stepped forward, his phone still trained on Jake, his stance unyielding. The lesson here was stark and unforgiving. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, embodied in the unblinking lenses of cameras, the resolve of a woman who refused to bend, and the courage of a man who wouldn't look away. Jake's abuse of power had consequences, ones that rippled beyond this gas station, threatening to dismantle the authority he'd wielded so carelessly. As the crowd watched, as the footage etched his actions into permanence, it became clear that power unchecked was a fragile thing easily broken. When faced with accountability, the air at the gas station was thick with tension, buzzing like static electricity on the verge of sparking. Jake Miller's voice sliced through it, sharp and triumphant, as he crowed, "This is going viral." His eyes gleamed with a twisted satisfaction as he glared at Maya Harper, his words dripping with venom. "You think you're walking away from this unscathed? Think again." His face contorted, a storm of fury twisting his feature cheeks flushed, jaw clenched so tight it seemed his teeth might crack. Yet, despite the fire raging inside him, he hesitated. The weight of Tom's camera, its unblinking lens trained on him, and the growing crowd of onlookers pressing in from all sides seemed to tether him to the ground. His hands twitched at his sides, restless, itching to lash out. But he took a reluctant step back from Maya's car, his boots scuffing the cracked pavement. Tom, standing a few feet away, lowered his voice as he turned to Maya, concern softening the edges of his usual casual tone. "You okay, Captain?" His brow furrowed, his grip on the phone tightening as he kept it steady, capturing every second of the unfolding chaos. Maya exhaled slowly, her shoulders sagging just slightly under the invisible burden she carried. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice betrayed here a faint tremor ran beneath it, the weariness of a woman who'd fought this war too many times before. She straightened, turning to face Jake again, her gaze locking onto his with the precision of a hawk spotting prey. "This stops now, Jake," she said, her words firm, cutting through the humid night air. "Call your supervisor, or I'll do it for you." Her tone left no room for negotiation, a steel thread woven through every syllable. Jake froze, his next move teetering on a knife's edge. The gas station fell into an eerie hush, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead the only sound as the crowd held its breath, waiting to see if he'd back down or double down. The tension coiled tighter, a suffocating blanket draped over the scene. Maya Harper stood tall, her posture unwavering, her dark eyes boring into Jake Miller with an intensity born from years of battlesome won, some lost but none ever abandoned. She could feel the chaos swirling around her, the spilled contents of her car littering the pavement, papers fluttering in the breeze, a half-empty coffee cup rolling lazily toward the curbed murmurs of the onlookers, rippling like waves, and the ever-present glare of Tom's phone, immortalizing every moment. This wasn't just about her anymore. Jake's actions were a slap in the face to the oath she'd taken, the law she'd devoted her life to protecting. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a righteous fury that steadied her hand as she reached into her pocket. With a deliberate calm that belied the storm inside her, Maya pulled out her phone. Jake's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering across his face like shadows cast by a flickering street lamp. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rough, edged with unease. She didn't respond right away, letting the silence stretch as she dialed, her thumb moving with practiced precision. When a crisp, authoritative voice answered on the other end, she squared her shoulders and spoke, her words ringing out clear and unshaken. "This is Captain Maya Harper," she announced, her voice carrying over the crowd's murmurs like a beacon cutting through fog. "I'm at the corner of Elman and Jefferson, currently being harassed and unlawfully searched by one of your officers. I need immediate assistance." Jake's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the surface as his sneer deepened. "You think calling in reinforcements is gonna scare me?" He spat, his tone laced with disdain. "Your rank doesn't mean squat out here. I make the rules." Maya ended the call with a soft click, her eyes never leaving his. She took a step closer, her presence commanding, her words landing like a gavel. "The law makes the rules, Miller," she said, her voice slicing through his bravado with surgical precision. "And you're shattering every single one of them." Jake barked out a laugh, harsh and hollow, his hands balling into fists. "You really think you're untouchable, don't you?" He sneered, his eyes glinting with contempt. "That badge, that fancy title, you think they put you above the rest of us? Wake up, Harper. They don't." Maya didn't flinch. If anything, his words fueled the fire in her chest. She stepped forward again, closing the distance until they were mere inches apart, her breath steady, her voice rising with unshakable resolve. "This isn't about accountability, Miller. This is about you abusing your power. You think that uniform gives you a free pass to bully and intimidate whoever you want. It doesn't." Her words struck him like a physical blow, and for a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a darkening fury. "You don't get to lecture me about power," he snapped, his voice climbing, raw and ragged. "You don't know what it's like out here working the graveyard shift, wading through the filth this city spits out every night. You sit in your cushy office, pretending you get it, but you don't. You've never had to claw your way up, never had to fight for respect." The irony of his words hit Maya like a punch to the gut. Her fists clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms, but her voice remained a steady blade. "Every step I've taken in this career has been a fight, Miller. Don't you dare stand there and tell me I don't know what it's like." Her eyes blazed, memories flashing behind them late nights, proving herself in a world that doubted her. The weight of every badge she'd earned pressing down on her shoulders. She wouldn't let him rewrite her story. From behind the camera, Tom's voice broke through, calm but pointed. "You're losing it, Jake. Everyone here can see it. Stop before you bury yourself deeper." His phone never wavered. A silent witness to the unraveling scene, Jake whirled on him, his frustration erupting like a volcano. "Shut up," he roared, his face flushing crimson, veins bulging at his temples. "Stay out of this." Tom didn't budge, his stance relaxed but resolute. "The whole world's gonna see this, Miller," he said coolly. "You think you're calling the shots, but you're just digging your own grave." Jake spun back to Maya, his movements erratic, his control slipping like sand through his fingers. "Fine," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You want to play this game? Let's see how far that title of yours really gets you." He loomed closer, his shadow falling over her, but Maya stood her ground, unflinching. "And let's see how your actions tonight look on camera," she shot back, her voice a steady anchor in the storm. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a chorus of discontent swelling around them. A man near the gas pumps shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This is out of control." Beside him, a woman yanked out her phone, joining Tom in filming, her hands trembling with a mix of fear and outrage. Jake's head snapped toward the growing sea of cameras, sweat beading on his brow, the pressure visibly crushing him. But instead of backing off, he dug in deeper, his pride a chain he couldn't or wouldn't break. "Everyone back off," he bellowed, his voice cracking like brittle glass. "This is a police matter." Maya took one final step forward, her voice rising above the chaos, clear and commanding. "This is a matter of justice," she declared, her words echoing across the lot. "And right now, you're on the wrong side of it." The standoff reached its breaking point, the air so thick with tension it felt like the world might shatter. Jake's chest heaved, his eyes wild, locked on Maya's unyielding stare. Then, from the corner of her vision, she caught a glimpse of movement, a familiar figure striding across the lot with purpose. Mark Reynolds, a fellow officer with a no-nonsense reputation. cut through the crowd like a ship through choppy waters. His voice boomed, sharp and demanding. "Jake, what the hell is going on here?" Jake froze, his face paling as recognition hit. Mark's rival was a curveball he hadn't seen coming, and it rattled him. His shoulders stiffened, but he masked his unease with a scowl. "This doesn't concern you, Mark," he snapped, his tone tight as a coiled spring. "I've got it under control." Mark didn't break stride, closing the distance with quick, purposeful steps until he stood between Jake and Maya, his broad frame a wall of authority. "Under control," he repeated, his voice dripping with skepticism. "This looks like anything but control. What are you trying to prove here?" Jake bristled, his fingers tightening around his baton, knuckles whitening. "Back off, Mark," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "This is my call." She was acting suspicious. Mark's eyebrow arched, his disbelief plain as day. "Suspicious? She's a captain, Jake, in full uniform. What part of that screams suspicious to you?" Jake faltered, the weight of Mark's words sinking in. But he clung to his defiance. "She's in a high-crime area, late at night," he muttered, his confidence waning. "I'm just doing my job." Mark's eyes narrowed, his voice rising with barely contained frustration. "Your job is to uphold the law, not twist it to fit your ego. You're targeting her, and we both know it." Jake took a step back, his gaze darting to Tom's phone, then to the crowd, the reality of his situation pressing down like a vice. Sweat glistened on his forehead, but his pride held him fast. "I don't need a lecture from you, Mark," he said, his tone defensive, almost pleading. "You don't know the full story." "I don't need the full story," Mark shot back, his voice a thunderclap. "What I see is an officer out of line, harassing someone without cause. That's all the story I need." The crowd murmured in agreement, their unease morphing into quiet fury. A woman near the edge of the lot whispered to her friend, "He's gone too far. That other cop's right." Her friend nodded, clutching her own phone tighter, her eyes wide with a mix of awe and anger. Maya stood silent behind Mark, her presence a pillar of strength, her composure speaking louder than words. She didn't need to fight this battle. Mark was doing it for her, and the crowd was bearing witness. Mark gestured toward the scattered wreckage of Maya's car papers strewn across the pavement, a cracked sunglasses case glinting under the harsh lights. "You tore apart a captain's vehicle with no probable cause," he said, his voice steady but searing. "Shoved her around in front of witnesses, and now you're doubling down on this disaster. If you don't stop right now, I'll call internal affairs myself." Jake's face twisted, frustration and fear warring within him. "You're taking her side," he spat, his voice rising in desperation. Mark's response was swift and unrelenting. "There are no sides, Jake. There's right, and there's wrong, and you're dead wrong." The weight of Mark's words crashed down on Jake, his bravado crumbling like dry clay. His eyes darted wildly between Mark's stern gaze, Maya's unflinching resolve, and the sea of faces watching, judging. For a moment, he seemed to shrink, the cracks in his armor gaping wide. "Look," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with a defensive edge. "I was just trying to do my job." If she Mark cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. "You're trying to save face. This isn't about her. It's about you, and the consequences of what you've done tonight." The night stretched on, heavy with the lessons it carried. Justice wasn't just a word, it was a force, one that demanded accountability, one that toppled those who wielded power like a weapon. Jake's fall wasn't just his own, it was a warning etched in the flickering light of the gas station, a reminder that the law bent for no one, not even those who swore to uphold it. And as the crowd watched, phones raised like torches, Maya stood firm, a testament to the strength it took to face down corruption and win. The air at the gas station hung thick with tension, a palpable electricity crackling beneath the flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Jake stood there, his broad frame rigid, the lines of his face tightening as Mark's words sliced through the night like a cold wind. His expression darkened, shadows pooling in the hollows of his eyes, but he didn't utter a single syllable in response. The truth Mark had laid bare was a heavy, unyielding thing, pressing down on Jake's chest until it felt like he couldn't draw a full breath. There was no room for denial, no crevice for excuses to hide in, and that realization gnawed at him, a bitter taste rising in his throat. Mark took a deliberate step closer, his boots scuffing against the cracked pavement, his voice dropping to a low, measured rumble that carried an edge of steel. "Do you really believe this is how we mend what's broken, Jake? That this is how we earn back the trust of the people we swore to protect? By clawing at each other in full view of everyone, tearing down whatever scraps of faith they still have in us, by swaggering around like some reckless cowboy instead of acting like the professionals we're supposed to be." His eyes bored into Jake's, unwavering and sharp, each word a hammer striking at the fragile wall of Jake's defiance. "This kind of behavior, it's a poison, Jake. It seeps into everything we stand for, and right now, you're the one pouring it out. You're dragging us all down with you." Jake's jaw twitched, his lips parting as if to fire back a retort, but the words withered before they could take shape. His hand, once clenched tight around the smooth, worn handle of his baton, slackened, the weapon dangling loosely at his side like a forgotten relic. The weight of it felt foreign now, a symbol of authority that had slipped through his fingers. He stared at Mark, his chest heaving with a storm of frustration and shame he couldn't quite name, the silence between them stretching taut as a wire. Then came Tom's voice, sharp and piercing, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "You hear that, Jake?" he called out, his tone loud enough to ripple through the gathered crowd, who shifted restlessly on the edges of the scene. "Even your own partner knows you've crossed the line. Time to call it quits, man." Tom stood a few paces back, his phone held steady in his hand, the tiny red light of its camera blinking as it captured every moment. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices a low hum that grew bolder with each passing second, their collective presence swelling as they sensed the tide turning against Jake. Their eyes, dozens of them, glinted in the dim light, watching, waiting, judging. Mark shifted his stance, turning just enough to catch Captain Maya Harper in his peripheral vision. His voice softened, though it retained its steady resolve. "Captain Harper, you okay?" he asked, genuine concern threading through his words. Maya stood a few feet away, her posture straight as a steel rod, her dark uniform crisp despite the chaos that had unfolded. Her face was a mask of calm, but beneath it, a flicker of exhaustion danced in her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice cool and firm, each syllable deliberate. "But this doesn't end here or not until this kind of thing stops for good." There was a quiet fire in her tone, a promise that this wasn't just a moment, but a battle she intended to see through. Mark gave a small nod, his respect for her shining through the tight line of his mouth. Then he turned back to Jake, his gaze hardening once more, eyes narrowing like a predator sizing up its prey. "You've got a choice to make, Jake," he said, his voice low and unyielding. "Walk away right now, or face the fallout of everything you've set in motion tonight. And believe me, there will be consequence. You've made damn sure of that." The words hung heavy in the air, a warning wrapped in certainty. Jake's face flushed a deep, angry red, the heat rising from his neck to his cheeks, a volatile mix of rage and humiliation pulsing through him. He could feel the weight of the crowd's stares, the cold, unblinking eyes of their phones recording every twitch of his expression, every falter in his stance. His gaze darted to Maya, who stood resolute, her chin lifted slightly, her presence a quiet rebuke to his unraveling composure. "I was just trying to do my job," he muttered, his voice rough and frayed, the fight draining out of him like water through a sieve. But even as he spoke, the excuse sounded hollow, a weak echo against the wall of truth Mark had built. Mark didn't flinch. "You want to do your job," he shot back, his tone slicing through Jake's feeble defense. "Then start by owning up to what you did wrong. Start by treating people with the respect they're entitled. Tone it like they're pawns in some power game you're playing." The crowd leaned in, their silence thick with anticipation, their breath held as they waited to see what Jake would do next. For a moment, Jake stood frozen, his shoulders rigid, his defiance a brittle shell cracking under the pressure of Mark's words, and Maya's unflinching stare. Then, slowly, his posture sagged, the tension bleeding out of him as he took a reluctant step back. The baton slid back into its loop on his belt with a faint clink, a surrender he didn't dare voice. "Fine," he muttered, barely audible, the word tasting like ash on his tongue. "It's over." Mark didn't budge, his eyes still locked on Jake, unrelenting. "It's not over until you're gone," he said, his voice firm as granite. Jake hesitated, his pride waging a silent war with the sliver of reason still left in him. Finally, with a sharp jerk of his head, he turned and stalked toward his patrol car, his boots pounding the pavement with more force than necessary. The crowd parted like a sea, their gazes tracking him, a mix of disdain and relief flickering across their faces as he yanked open the driver's side door and threw himself inside. The door slammed shut with a resounding bang, and the engine roared to life, a guttural snarl that shattered the night's heavy quiet. Tires screeched against asphalt as he peeled out of the lot, the taillights disappearing into the darkness, leaving behind a void thick with unresolved tension. Inside the car, Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles blanched white, the leather creaking under his fingers, his pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out the hum of the engine. Mark's words replayed in his mind, each one a thorn digging deeper into his pride. Maya's steady, unyielding presence loomed in his memory, a silent accusation he couldn't shake. And the crowd, those nameless faces, their silent judgment pressed down on him like a physical weight, suffocating him. He stared straight ahead through the windshield, refusing to glance at the stragglers still milling about the gas station, their silhouettes blurred in the rearview mirror. The humiliation burned, a raw, jagged thing clawing at his insides. But his stubborn pride wouldn't let him slink away entirely defeated. With a ragged breath, he shoved the door open one last time and stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with a deliberate thud that echoed in the stillness. The crowd's murmurs hushed as he approached, his face a storm cloud of barely restrained fury. He ignored Mark, his glare zeroing in on Maya with venomous intensity. "Fine," he spat, his voice low and dripping with resentment. "I'll go. But don't think this is the end of it, Harper." His words were a challenge, a promise of retribution simmering beneath the surface. Maya didn't waver, her gaze locking with his, calm and piercing. "It is the end, Miller," she said evenly, her tone cutting through his bravado like a knife. "And if you think you can scare me into backing down, you're wasting your breath." She took a step forward, her presence towering despite her average height, her authority radiating in the set of her shoulders and the steel in her voice. "People like me," she repeated, seizing his earlier jab and turning it back on him, her words sharp and deliberate. "If you mean people who stand up when power gets twisted, who fight for what's right instead of what's easy, then yeah, I'm one of them. And I'll never regret it." Jake's lip curled into a sneer, his anger flaring anew, a wildfire desperate for fuel. "You think you've won because you've got a few cameras on your side," he hissed, his eyes flicking to the crowd, to the phones still trained on him, their lenses glinting like predators in the dark. "Don't forget, Harper, you've got people in the department. This isn't going to end the way you think." Maya's expression didn't falter, her voice slicing through his threats with surgical precision. "Go ahead and pull whatever strings you think you've got, Miller. But justice isn't about who you know, it's about what's right. And you're dead wrong." Her words landed like a gavel, final and unshakable. Tom stepped forward then, his phone still recording, his broad frame casting a shadow across the pavement. "You done yet, Miller?" he asked, his voice thick with mockery, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Because all you're doing now is burying yourself deeper." His hazel eyes glinted with a mix of defiance and disgust, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a hard-edged resolve. He'd always been the joker of the precinct, quick with a quip, but tonight he was a man fed up, his patience worn thin by Jake's antics. Jake wheeled on him, his frustration boiling over. "Stay out of this, Carter," he snarled, his fists clenching at his sides, knuckles whitening anew. But Tom didn't flinch, his stance steady, his voice cool and unwavering. "You're the one who needs to back off, Jake. This isn't some sandbox you get to stomp around in. This is your career, your life, fiend. You're torching it with every word." Jake's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding audibly as he fought to keep his temper in check. He swung his gaze back to Maya, his eyes blazing with a toxic blend of fury and resentment. "You think you're better than me," he growled, his voice a low rumble, almost lost in the night air. Maya met his stare head-on, her response calm, but laced with an unshakable conviction. "I don't think I'm better than you, Jake," she said, her tone steady as a heartbeat. "I think I'm better than this, and you should be too." The crowd stirred, their quiet agreement a soft ripple that added weight to her words. A chorus of support she didn't need to ask for. Jake's face twisted, his anger a jagged edge, but the fire in him was guttering out. He was a man cornered, his bravado crumbling under the combined force of Maya's resolve, Mark's unrelenting pressure, and Tom's biting clarity. With a sharp, frustrated jerk, he spun on his heel and stormed back to his car. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the frame, and the engine roared to life once more, tires shrieking as he tore out of the lot, leaving a trail of dust and tension in his wake. The gas station fell silent for a heartbeat, the air thick with the aftertaste of conflict, like the lingering smoke of a doused fire. Then, slowly, the crowd's voices rose again, a murmur of relief and quiet triumph weaving through them. Maya let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing just a fraction as she turned to Mark. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice steady despite the storm she'd just weathered, a faint tremor of gratitude beneath her composure. Mark nodded, his respect for her etched into the lines of his face. "You handled that better than most could have," he said, his tone warm but tinged with a quiet frustration. "But you shouldn't have had to." His eyes flicked to the crowd, then back to her, a shared understanding passing between them. Tom stepped closer, lowering his phone, but keeping it gripped tightly in his hand, the screen still glowing faintly. "This is going viral, Captain," he said, his voice carrying a mix of reassurance and gravity. "Everyone's going to see what went down here tonight." His usually playful demeanor was tempered now, his broad shoulders squared as he took in the weight of the moment. Maya's gaze shifted to the crowd, her expression resolute. "Good," she said, her voice firm and clear. "Let them see what's broken. Let them know what we need to fix." There was no hesitation in her, no trace of doubt, just a quiet, burning determination that seemed to light the space around her. As Tom tapped at his phone, uploading the video with a few deft swipes, the footage began its rapid spread, a spark igniting a wildfire across the digital landscape. Within hours, it was everywhere, social media feeds buzzing with the raw, unfiltered clip of Jake Miller's overreach, Maya Harper's steadfast courage, and the crowd's unwavering support. Hashtags like "Justice for Maya" and "Cops Accountability" surged to the top of trending lists, comments flooding in beneath the video like a tidal wave. "This is what's wrong with the system," one user wrote, their words echoed by thousands. "Captain Harper's a damn Harish stood her ground with grace. Miller needs to go, no excuses." The outcry didn't stop at social media. News outlets snatched up the story, replaying the footage alongside bold headlines, "Caught on camera. Officer's abuse of power sparks fury. Captain Harper stands firm against police misconduct." Internal probe launched after viral video. The attention was relentless, a spotlight that refused to dim, and the pressure on Jake Miller grew heavier by the minute. By midday, the police department buckled under the weight of public outrage, announcing an internal investigation. Chief Daniels, his tie slightly askew and his face etched with discomfort, faced a swarm of reporters at a hastily assembled press conference. "We take these allegations very seriously," he said, his voice tight as he sidestepped questions about Jake's fate. "The department is committed to accountability and a thorough review of this incident." Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was a pressure cooker ready to blow. Jake strode in that morning, his boots echoing on the tiled floor, only to find conversations dying mid-sentence as he passed. Colleagues who once traded laughs with him over lukewarm coffee now averted their eyes, their silence a condemnation louder than words. The air was thick with disapproval, a tangible shift that made his skin prickle. Then came Detective Laura Green, her weary frame blocking his path near his desk, her sharp brown eyes blazing with indignation. "What the hell were you thinking, Jake?" she demanded, her voice low but fierce, cutting through the hum of the station. "That video's a train wreck. You've dragged us all through the mud with you." Jake scowled, his frustration flaring like a struck match. "You weren't there, Laura," he snapped, his voice rough with defensiveness. "You don't know how it went down." Laura didn't back down, her hands planted on her hips, her stance unyielding. "I don't need to be there to see you screwed up, Jake. The whole world's watching now. and you've got no one to blame but yourself." Her words were a mirror he couldn't escape, reflecting the consequences of his actions in stark, unforgiving clarity. The lesson was unmistakable. Power, when wielded without restraint, didn't just harm its targets, it corroded the one holding it, leaving behind a wreckage of trust and respect. For Jake, the cost was still unfolding, a reckoning he couldn't outrun. For Maya, Mark, Tom, and even Laura, it was a call to stand taller, to fight harder, to ensure justice wasn't just a word, but a reality carved out of moments like this. The crowd at the gas station, the viewers online, the voices rising, they all bore witness to a truth as old as time. Abuse of power carried a price, and those who paid it most dearly were the ones too blind to see the scales tipping against them. The air in the precinct office crackled with tension as Laura's voice sliced through the room, sharp and unyielding, cutting off Jake mid-sentence. "Don't even try to explain it away," she snapped, her words dripping with frustration. "We all saw the video. You weren't a friend of story." Her icy glare bore into him, unwavering, as if daring him to push back. Jake's temper flared in response, his hand crashing down onto the worn wooden desk with a thud that echoed through the small space. "I was doing my damn job," he roared, his voice rising like a storm, raw with defiance. His chest heaved as he leaned forward, knuckles whitening against the desk's edge. Laura didn't flinch. No, she shot back, her tone as cold as a winter night. "You let your ego run the show, and now we're all stuck cleaning up your mess." Her words hung there, heavy and accusing, leaving no room for retreat. Outside, beyond the precinct's grimy windows, the world was stirring. A restless crowd was gathering under the gray March sky, their voices swelling into chants that reverberated off the brick walls. Protesters clutched signs that danced in the wine bowl, hand-painted letters screaming "End police misconduct" and "Stand with Captain Harper." The air buzzed with their anger and hope, a chaotic symphony of shouts and footsteps. At the heart of it all was the video, a shaky, grainy clip of Captain Maya Harper standing tall and unflinching against Jake's towering rage. That moment their calm resolve against his reckless fury had lit a spark in the community. To them, Maya wasn't just an officer anymore. She was a beacon of strength, a living testament to what integrity could look like in a system so often stained by corruption. Meanwhile, Jake's name was being dragged through the mud. Editorials dissected his every move, their words sharp as knives, while TV interviews with civil rights leaders painted him as a poster child for everything wrong with law enforcement. "This isn't just about one man," Sarah Thompson, a fiery activist with a voice that commanded attention, declared on a late-night panel show. The studio lights glinted off her determined eyes as she leaned forward. "It's about a culture eroding, festering culture that lets power run wild without a leash." Captain Harper showed guts, real guts, but she shouldn't have had to. "The whole system's begging for an overhaul, and we can't wait another day." The criticism didn't stop there. Even those who'd once worn the badge couldn't stay silent. Retired Sergeant David Lopez, his weathered face etched with years of hard-earned wisdom, sat down for an interview, his voice trembling with a mix of sorrow and regret. "Watching that footage hurt," he admitted, staring into the camera as if confessing to an old friend. "Building trust with the people we serve is like climbing a mountain's low, grueling work. Then something like this happens, and it's all gone, tumbling down in one night. Years of effort erased." His hands, rough and callous from decades on the job, clenched into fists as he spoke, betraying the frustration he couldn't quite hide. Back at home, Jake sat slouched on his sagging couch, the dim glow of his TV casting flickering shadows across the room. The walls felt like they were closing in, pressing against him as he scrolled through an endless stream of news articles on his phone. Headlines blared accusations, officers' outburst sparks outrage. Police brutality caught on tape, each one a fresh wound to his pride. His phone buzzed relentlessly on the cushion beside him, a chorus of notifications he couldn't bring himself to face. A few friends reached out, their messages tentative and awkward, offering support that felt more like pity. Reporters hounded him too, their voicemails piling up, each one hungry for a soundbite to twist. He ignored them all, letting the silence of his cluttered apartment swallow him whole. Inside, his emotions churned: anger, resentment, A bitter stew simmering hotter with every passing minute. "They don't get it," he muttered to himself, pacing the creaky floorboards, his boots thudding with each step. "I've been out there, day after day, staring down the worst of humanity. I've seen what happens when you hesitate, when you let your guard down." But even as he clung to that justification, a gnawing doubt clawed at the edges of his mind. The video didn't lie. His actions that night hadn't been about Brutality, they'd been about him, about proving something, anything, to himself. The realization sat like a stone in his gut, heavy and undeniable. Across town, Maya Harper was navigating a different storm. Her inbox overflowed with messages, a flood of words from people she'd never met, strangers thanking her, colleagues pledging solidarity, even old friends she hadn't spoken to in years reaching out to say they were proud. "You're a hero." One email gushed, the sender's enthusiasm practically leaping off the screen. "Thank you for standing up when it mattered." Another, from a young woman in the community. "Read simply, you give me hope." The praise washed over her, warm but fleeting. Sitting at her desk in the quiet of her office, surrounded by stacks of files and the faint hum of a fluorescent light, Maya stayed grounded. She knew this wasn't about her, really. Her fingers hovered over her keyboard as she drafted a public statement, each word chosen with care. "This isn't just one bad night," she typed, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's about accountability, about rebuilding trust between us and the people we swore to protect. I'm here to push for a system that serves everyone and not just a few." In interviews, she stuck to the same script, her voice steady as she deflected the spotlight. "Yes, I held my ground," she told a local reporter, her dark eyes meeting his with quiet resolve. "But this isn't my story. It's about making sure nights like that don't happen again. It's about justice being the rule, not the exception." Jake, though, wasn't ready to let go of his defenses. Alone in his apartment, the curtains drawn tight against the world outside, he replayed that night over and over in his head. The shouts, the chaos, the way his blood had pounded in his ears, it all felt righteous in the moment. Every stinging comment online, every headline branding him a villain, hit him like a personal betrayal. "They don't know what it's like," he growled, his voice low and ragged as he paced faster, his shadow stretching across the peeling wallpaper. "They sit there judging me, safe behind their screens, while I'm the one out there keeping the streets from falling apart." But the evidence was a mirror he couldn't escape. Deep down, beneath the bravado, he knew it wasn't about the law that night, it was about his pride, his need to dominate. A sharp knock at the door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. He froze, then shuffled over, peering through the peephole. Chief Daniels stood there, his broad frame filling the doorway, his face set in a grim line. "Jake," Daniels said as the door creaked open, his voice steady but edged with authority. "We need to talk." Jake stepped aside, his jaw tight, letting the chief in. The older man wasted no time. "This investigation's serious," Daniels began, planting himself in the middle of the cramped living room. "You've put us all in a hell of a spot. You need to cooperate, fly, and start owning what you did." Jake's fists clenched at his sides. "So I'm just supposed to sit back and let them tear me apart?" he snapped, his voice thick with defiance. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "No," he said, sharp and cutting. "You're supposed to act like a man and take responsibility. That's what separates a real officer from a coward." As the video spread like wildfire across screens everywhere, the pressure on the department grew suffocating. Community leaders stood on street corners, megaphones in hand, their voices booming with demands for justice. Local politicians scrambled to issue statements, their words polished but urgent, while national organizations threw their weight behind the cause, calling for sweeping change. This wasn't just about Jake anymore, it was about the badge itself, about what it stood for. Maya, meanwhile, braced herself for what was coming. She knew this fight was bigger than one incident, bigger than her or Jake or any single soul in the precinct. Sitting at her desk late into the night, she scribbled notes, her pen scratching against the paper as she mapped out ways to turn the public's fury into something lasting. The momentum was there, she could feel it, but it was fragile, teetering on the edge of chaos. The reckoning came to a head in the precinct's conference hall, a cavernous room with flickering lights and a long, scratched-up table. Senior officers, department heads, and policymakers filed in, their faces a mix of exhaustion and unease. Chief Daniels sat at the head, his hands clasped tightly, his expression carved from stone. The viral video and the tidal wave of outrage had dragged them all here, but the air was thick with resistance-crisped arms, furrowed brows, whispers of dissent. Maya stepped inside, her boots clicking against the linoleum floor, her presence like a quiet thunder. She didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. Her steady gaze did that for her. This wasn't about defending herself, it was about forcing them to look at the cracks they'd ignored for too long. The murmurs faded as Daniels cleared his throat. "Captain Harper," he said, his tone formal but tinged with respect, "you called this meeting. The floor is yours." Maya rose, her movements deliberate, her spine straight as she met every pair of eyes around the table. "Thank you, Chief," she began, her voice calm but unyielding, a river carving through rock. "What happened that night wasn't just a fluke. It was a symptom, a loud, ugly symptom of a disease we've let fester in this department for years." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. The room was still, save for the rustle of papers and a faint cough from the back. "I've spent my whole career trying to build bridges with the people we serve," she went on, her tone growing firmer. "But trust, it's fragile as glass. One crack on night like that and it shatters. When an officer abuses their power, when they let ego or bias call the shots, it doesn't just hurt the person on the receiving end. It tears at the roots of everything we're supposed to stand for." Her eyes flicked to Deputy Chief Frank Ellis, a grizzled veteran whose skepticism was etched into every line of his face. He shifted in his seat, arms crossed tighter. "We need change," Maya pressed, her voice rising with conviction. "Not band-aids, not excuse reel. Systemic change. Mandatory bias training for every officer. No exceptions." Becca's pretending we don't have blind spots isn't noble, it's reckless. Accountability that actually means something, a process people can see, not a rug to sweep complaints under. Programs to get us out there, talking to the communities we serve, listening to them, letting them help us figure out what works, and recruit mentoring people who look like the folks we're protecting, who get what they're going through, who live the values we preach. She took a breath, her gaze sweeping the room again. "We can't keep saying we're here for the people while propping up a system that chews them up. That's not justice, that's cowardice." The room erupted as she sat down, voices clashing like waves against a cliff. "She's right," Daniel said, nodding slowly, his gravelly voice cutting through the noise. "We've patched over the holes too long. This can't wait." But not everyone was on board. Frank Ellis leaned forward, his bushy brows knitting together, his tone dripping with disdain. "Bias training. Come on, Captain. You're telling me we should treat every officer like they're guilty, before they've even stepped out of line? That's how you kill morale, not build it." Maya didn't blink. "It's not about guilt," she countered, her voice like steel. "It's about making sure we don't cross that line in the first place. Morale doesn't come from turning a blind eye, it comes from knowing we're doing the job right." Ellis scowled, his lips parting for a retort, but Commissioner Laura Price jumped in, her measured tone smoothing the edges of the fray. "Captain Harper's got a point," she said, adjusting her glasses. "The public's faith in us is hanging by a thread. If we don't move now, we're done." Ellis shook his head, stubborn as ever. "We can't just bend over every time some video blows up online. One bad apple doesn't mean the whole tree's rotten." Maya's response was swift, her voice slicing through the tension. "One bad apple can spoil the barrel, Deputy Chief. And when it's not just one win, it's a pattern. We're not talking coincidence anymore. We're talking failure. Are we really going to sit here and act like we don't see it?" The room fell silent, her words a thunderclap. Support for her ideas was swelling edge from Daniels, a quiet damn right from Price, but the old guard dug in their heels. Maya stood again, her voice trembling with passion now, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "This isn't about politics or PR," she said, her eyes blazing. "It's about what's right. Every time we let misconduct slide, we're telling our communities their lives don't matter. Justice isn't just a word, it's a promise, and we've been breaking it for too damn long." The lesson was clear. Power without restraint was a poison, seeping into the cracks of even the noblest institutions. Jake's fall wasn't just his own, it was a warning. a flare lighting up the cost of unchecked arrogance. Maya's stand, though, was a lifeline, a chance to pull the system back from the brink. The consequences of abuse weren't abstract. They were faces in the crowd, voices in the streets, trust shattered on a cold precinct floor. Justice demanded more than punishment. It demanded change, deep and lasting. To keep that promise alive, the precinct felt like a pressure cooker that afternoon, the air thick with tension that seemed to cling to every surface. Scuffed linoleum floors, the chipped paint on the walls, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Captain Maya Harper stood at the front of the room, her dark eyes scanning the faces of the officers and administrators gathered before her. She could feel the weight of their stares, some supportive, others laced with skepticism or outright hostility. Her voice, steady at first, began to tremble ever so slightly as her emotions bubbled to the surface, cracking the polished composure she'd spent years perfecting. "We've told ourselves their lives don't matter," she said, her words slicing through the stale air. "We've sent a message to our officers that accountability is something they can choose to ignore. And we've convinced ourselves that the system is too broken to fix." She paused, her chest tightening as she thought of the gas station incident, the grainy video of Officer Jake Miller's actions looping endlessly in her mind. "But we can't let moments like this become who we are. We can't let the failures of a few cast a shadow over the dedication of so many who wear this badge with honor. If we don't act, if we don't demand justice, that's exactly what will happen." The room fell into a heavy silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes every breath feel deliberate. Even the officers who'd grumbled against her earlier, their arms crossed and jaws tight, seemed to waver under the gravity of her plea. Their eyes flickered with doubt, as if her words had slipped past their defenses and lodged somewhere deep. After what felt like an eternity of hushed debate, murmurs rising and falling like waves. Against a rocky shore, Keith Daniels, a towering man with graying hair and a face etched with years of hard decisions, raised his hand. "Let's take a preliminary vote on Captain Harper's proposals," he announced, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. Hands lifted into the air, some shooting up with conviction, others dragging upward as if pulled by an invisible string. The result wasn't unanimous, but it tipped in her favor, a fragile majority willing to take the first step toward reform. Maya's shoulders relaxed just a fraction, a quiet breath escaping her lips. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. She knew this was no victory, not yet. Policies didn't bend with a single meeting, and the undercurrent of resistance in the room told her the real battle was still ahead. As the meeting broke apart, officers shuffling out with muted conversations, Chief Daniels approached her. His boots clicked against the floor, each step deliberate, like a man who'd seen too many storms to rush through one. "You did good today, Captain," he said, his voice softening, though his eyes remained sharp. "But this is just the starting line." Maya met his gaze, her expression resolute. "I know, Chief," she replied, her tone carrying a quiet fire. "And I'm ready." She turned to leave, the precinct quieter now, almost eerily so. The fallout from the gas station incident hung over the building like a fog. Every officer who'd watched that video or skimmed the screaming headlines carried it with them, an unspoken burden that tightened their shoulders and darkened their moods. Across the hall, in a small, sparsely furnished conference room, Officer Jake Miller sat alone. The walls were bare, the table scratched and worn, and a single white folder lay in front of him, its edges crisp against the dull wood. Inside it was the official notice of his suspension, a cold, formal declaration that his career now dangled by a thread. His hazel eyes, usually sharp with defiance, were fixed on that folder, as if staring hard enough might erase the words within. His fingers twitched against its edge, a restless tick betraying the storm brewing inside him. The door opened with a soft creak, and Chief Daniels stepped in, closing it behind him with a click that echoed like a gavel. Jake didn't look up, his jaw clenched tight. Daniels stood there for a moment, sizing him up, then spoke. "You've backed yourself into a corner, Jake," he said, his voice firm but tinged with something softer, disappointment, maybe, or regret. "This department doesn't tolerate behavior like that. The evidence is stacked against you, and it's not looking good." Jake's head tilted slightly, his voice barely above a whisper when he finally responded. I didn't mean for it to spiral like this. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. I thought I was doing what I was supposed to me job. Daniels crossed his arms, his broad frame casting a shadow over the table. His face was a mask, unreadable. But his words cut deep. Your job is to serve and protect, not to let your anger or your prejudices call the shots. If you want a future here, you've got a choice. Face up to what you've done, or keep burying yourself deeper. But let me be clear, there's no room in this precinct for someone who won't grow. Jake didn't answer right away. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, as the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought of the video, his raised voice, his heavy hand, the fear in that man's eyes at the gas station. For years, he'd worn his badge like a shield, fueled by a simmering resentment he'd never fully unpacked. Now, that shield was cracking, and he wasn't sure what was left underneath. Meanwhile, across the sprawling city, Maya Harper drove home through streets she knew like the back of her hand. The hum of her car's engine was a soothing constant against the blur of neon lights and shadowed buildings streaming past her windows. She'd just come from another press briefing, her voice steady as she'd faced a barrage of microphones and flashing cameras, promising reform, accountability, justice. The fight was far from over. If anything, it was only picking up steam. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, pulling her from her thoughts. A quick glance revealed a message from a local community leader. "Thank you, Captain, for standing up. You're giving us hope." The words warmed her, but she didn't linger on them. Her focus stayed ahead, her mind replaying the meeting from earlier. The hesitant hands, the guarded stares. Progress had been made, yes, but the roots of resistance ran deep, tangled in decades of tradition and unspoken loyalties. Changing that would take more than a vote or a speech. It would take relentless, bone-deep commitment. She pulled into her driveway, the crunch of gravel under her tires grounding her. Her gaze drifted to the folder beside her, stuffed with meeting notes, reform proposals, and names of officers ready to stand with her. She grabbed it, her grip steady, and stepped into the cool night air. Back at his modest apartment, Jake sat hunched over his kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. His phone sat in front of him, the notification light blinking incessantly. A missed call from his father. The old man hadn't spoken to him since the video hit the internet, but Jake could hear his voice anyway, gravelly and unyielding. Never show weakness. Never admit you're wrong. Those words had been his gospel, a mantra he'd clung to through every confrontation, every mistake. Now they rang hollow, crumbling under the reality of his suspension, the public outrage, the disappointment in Daniel's eyes. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling beneath his skin. The world he'd built brick by brick, fueled by bitterness and a need to prove himself, was falling apart, and he didn't know how to stop it. On the other side of town, Maya stood in her small, tidy living room, the folder now resting on her desk. She hesitated, her fingers brushing its edge, then opened it. Pages spilled out, handwritten notes, typed plans, a roadmap for the change she'd spent years dreaming of. As she flipped through them, her eyes narrowed with focus. This wasn't just about her ambition or her career. It was about every officer who'd ever felt trapped by a system that rewarded silence over integrity. It was about every person in this city who deserved to trust the badge, not fear it. She thought of the gas station video, of Jake's choices, and the lesson burned clear. Power without accountability was a poison, seeping into everything it touched. Justice demanded more. It demanded sacrifice, courage, a willingness to tear down what was broken and build something better. The next morning, the precinct buzzed with a nervous energy as officers filed into the training room for the department's first mandatory session on implicit bias. Maya lingered at the back, her arms crossed, watching as they took their seats. Some wore curious expressions, others barely hid their disdain. Mark Reynolds, a veteran officer with a calm demeanor and a dry sense of humor, sidled up to her. "You're stirring the pot, Captain," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Think they're ready for this?" Maya's gaze swept the room, taking in the mix of fast-sighing rookies, seasoned cynics, and everyone in between. "Ready or not, it's happening," she said firmly. "We've waited too long already." Mark nodded, his quiet support a steady anchor. For what it's worth, I've got your back. Always. She shot him a grateful look. I know, Mark, and I'm counting on you to help me see this through. Jake, meanwhile, sat on his sagging couch, staring at his phone as the training announcement popped up. His suspension barred him from attending, and the exclusion stung more than he'd expected. He tossed the phone aside, the thud echoing in the empty room. Daniel's words looped in his head on up or digged deeper, and his eyes drifted to his uniform, hanging limply on the back of a chair. The badge caught the light, a faint gleam that once filled him with pride. Now, it felt like a millstone. For the first time, a crack formed in his certainty. What if the problem wasn't just the system or the people calling him out? What if it was him, his choices, his refusal to bend? The thought gnawed at him, sharp and persistent, refusing to let go. That evening, Maya drove across town to a community meeting in a neighborhood scarred by years of mistrust and police overreach. The community center was packed, the air humming with anticipation as residents poured out their fears, their anger, their fragile hopes. Maya sat near the front, her notebook open, pen flying across the page as she listened. An elderly man spoke of losing his son to a trigger-happy cop. A teenage girl demanded a future where she wouldn't fear a traffic stop. Maya nodded, her heart aching with every story, her resolve hardening with every word. When the meeting ended, a young woman approached her, her hands trembling, but her voice fierce. Captain Harper, thank you for fighting for us. You've given us something to believe in. Maya smiled, her exhaustion melting into warmth. Thank you, she said sincerely. But this is just the start. I need you to keep pushing us, keep us honest. The woman nodded, her eyes mirroring Maya's determination. Driving home that night, the city lights danced across her windshield, fleeting shadows playing over her face. She thought of the road ahead, the pushback she'd face, the battles still to come. But she also thought of the people in that room, the officers like Mark who'd stand with her, the fragile hope she'd sparked. Glancing at the folder on her seat, she felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't just about rules or training sessions. It was about dismantling a legacy of abuse, about proving that justice could prevail if enough people fought for it. She stepped out of her car, the night air cool against her skin, her eyes blazing with purpose. Tomorrow's challenges were a mystery, but one truth anchored her: she'd never stop. In the end, Maya Harper's story and Jake Miller's unraveling painted a vivid picture of the struggle for justice. Her unwavering resolve lit a fire, showing that one person's voice could rattle a broken system and ripple outward, inspiring change. Jake's dissent, though, was a haunting warning. When power festers unchecked, when accountability is shrugged off, the fallout doesn't just scar the guilty, it wounds entire communities. Justice isn't a gift handed down, it's a garden cultivated through hard choices, torn roots, and patient growth. Maya planted the seeds, knowing the harvest might come long after her time. Jake faced the bitter fruit of his own making, a taste he couldn't spit out. Together, their paths reminded us that the fight for what's right is messy, relentless, and worth every step. The moment James stepped into the glass-walled fortress of the bank, he was enveloped by the familiar symphony of corporate life. The air buzzed with the relentless hum of ringing phones, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the polished marble floors. Muted voices floated around him, snippets of conversations blending into a dull roar, while the air conditioning roared overhead, blasting frigid gusts that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. At the reception desk, a young woman with a practiced smile greeted him, her expression as mechanical as the clicking of her manicured nails against the keyboard. "Please wait a moment," she said, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth, before picking up the phone to murmur a few quick words. With a flick of her wrist, she gestured toward the manager's office, her eyes barely meeting his as she returned to her screen. James crossed the bustling lobby, his polished shoes tapping rhythmically against the floor, and approached the heavy wooden door of Mr. Thompson's office. Inside, he was met by a man who exuded authority with every fiber of his being. Mr. Thompson, with his silver-gray hair swept back meticulously and a suit so impeccably tailored it seemed to have been sculpted onto his broad frame, didn't bother to look up from his glowing computer screen. His fingers danced across a stack of papers, flipping through them with a dismissive air. as if James's presence were an unwelcome interruption to his meticulously ordered world. "So what do you need?" Thompson's voice cut through the silence, sharp and icy, his tone dripping with a disdain that James could feel like a physical weight. Pressing against his chest, steadying himself, James straightened his posture and began to explain his request alone to expand his growing business. His words were measured, his voice calm, but inside, his mind churned with a mix of hope and quiet determination. He spoke of projections, profits, and potential, laying out his vision with the precision of a man who had spent countless nights refining it. But Thompson barely let him finish a sentence. The manager's eyes flicked up briefly, raking over James with a cold, appraising stare, as if sizing up an intruder who had dared to step into his domain. Each interruption was a jab, a signal that James was nothing more than a nuisance, a fly buzzing too close to his pristine desk. The contempt in Thompson's gaze was unmistakably a curl of the lip, a slight squint of the isis. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as though shielding himself from the audacity of James's ambition. "I'll be straight with you," Thompson finally said, his voice hardening as he enunciated each word with exaggerated precision. "This kind of loan, too big a risk for your profile." The way he lingered on those last two words felt like a slap, a deliberate attempt to shrink James down to something insignificant. "Try something smaller, something you can actually handle." The suggestion hung in the air, heavy with condescension, as if Thompson were tossing crumbs to a beggar rather than addressing a man with a legitimate proposal. James felt a flicker of heat rise in his chest, a spark of indignation threatening to ignite, but he smothered it beneath a serene mask. He wouldn't give Thompson the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Instead, he rose to his feet, extended his hand for a firm handshake, his grip steady despite the storm brewing inside, and offered a polite, "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." As he turned to leave, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. It wasn't the rejection that gnawed at him as he stepped out of the office. It was the predictability of it all. Thompson's arrogance, his snap judgment, his refusal to see beyond the surfaceite was a script James had encountered too many times before. But he was patient, and more than that, he was strategic. Outside, the sky loomed gray and heavy, a canopy of clouds that mirrored the weight of the moment. James paused on the sidewalk, adjusting the lapels of his coat as a gust of wind whipped past him. He tilted his head upward, letting the cool air brush against his face, and allowed himself a fleeting moment of doubt. Was it worth going backin'? Could he crack through the wall of prejudice that Thompson had built around himself? Then, with a slow exhale, his resolve hardened like steel. He turned on his heel and marched back into the branch, his steps purposeful, his mind alight with a quiet fire. The receptionist looked up as he approached, her curiosity tinged with a flicker of impatience. Her brow arched slightly, as if she were silently questioning his persistence. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Thompson again," James said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat, his polite smile unwavering. She hesitated, her lips pursing into a thin line, before picking up the phone with a sigh. "I'll see if he's available," she replied, her tone dry as the rustle of papers on her desk. A few murmured words later, she nodded curtly, signaling him to proceed. Back in the office, Thompson didn't bother to mask his irritation. The moment James stepped through the door, the manager let out a loud, exaggerated sigh, his broad shoulders slumping as he shuffled the papers in front of him with unnecessary force. "You again," he muttered, his voice thick with exasperation, as if James's return were a personal affront. "I thought I made myself clear." His eyes narrowed, glinting with the smug certainty of a man who believed he held all the power. James settled into the chair across from the desk, his movements deliberate, his expression unshaken. "I believe there was a misunderstanding," he began, folding his hands in his lap. "I'd like to go over the numbers in more detail. I don't think we fully explored the opportunity here." Inside, his pulse quickened not out of fear, but from the thrill of challenging the fortress of Thompson's ego. He could feel the weight of the moment, the chance to turn this confrontation into something meaningful. Thompson let out a low, mocking chuckle, shaking his head as his fingers tapped lazily at his keyboard. "My friend," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm, "I've been in this game for over 20 years. I can spot a lost cause from a mile away. You think you're the first dreamer to walk in here with big ideas? You won't be the last to leave with nothing." His words were a blade, sharp and cutting, meant to slice through James's confidence and leave him bleeding. But James didn't flinch. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs like a shield, and met Thompson's gaze head-on. "I understand your experience, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice calm but firm, "but I believe the numbers tell a different story. There's potential here for both of us." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking with the manager's, daring him to look beyond his preconceptions. Thompson's response was swift and brutal. He shoved the stack of papers across the desk, the document skidding toward James with a harsh scrape. "You think it's that easy?" he snapped, his voice rising with a mix of frustration and disdain. "You waltz in here, expecting me to hand you what you want just because you think you deserve it. That's not how this works. Frankly, you're overestimating yourself. This isn't a charity." James gathered the scattered papers with deliberate care, sliding them back into his folder as a quiet storm brewed behind his composed exterior. He could feel the sting of Thompson's words, each one a barb designed to wound, but he refused to let it show. "I was hoping for a more thorough review," he said at last, his tone edged with a frustration he could no longer fully conceal. "My company has a proven track record. I'm more than ready to discuss the details." Thompson leaned forward, his elbows planted firmly on the desk, his face hardening into a mask of condescension. "The problem isn't the numbers," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "It's you. People like you come in here every day, thinking they're going to change the world. But you don't get it. You're not ready for this kind of responsibility. That's the reality." The words hit James like a punch to the gut, but he held his ground. His eyes narrowed slightly, meeting Thompson's with a steely resolve. "You don't know me," he said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of defiance. "You've made your judgment awfully fast. I'm trying to figure out what's really at play here." Thompson barked out a laugh, loud and unrestrained, leaning back in his chair as if James's persistence were a grand joke. "You want to know what's at play? Fine. It's simple. You don't fit the profile for this kind of risk. It's not personal, it's just how it is." His tone was smug, final, as if he'd delivered an unassailable truth. But James saw through the fade. This wasn't just about numbers or risk, it was about power, about Thompson's need to assert his dominance over someone he'd already dismissed. James took a deep breath, forcing his voice to remain even. "So you think my appearance defines my capability?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. Thompson shook his head, a patronizing smile tugging at his lips. "It's not about your appearance, it's about the market. You might not like it, but that's the game. Maybe start smaller, something more in your league." The words could have cut deep, could have shaken someone less grounded, but James stood tall. "I appreciate your candor, Mr. Thompson," he said, rising to his feet with a quiet dignity. "But in business, rushing to judgment is the fastest way to miss an opportunity." He turned to leave, his parting words lingering in the air as Thompson offered only a vague nod, already turning back to his screen as if James had ceased to exist. As he passed the receptionist on his way out, her eyes flicked up from her keyboard, a faint pity softening her sharp features. "Didn't go well, did it?" she said, her voice flat, more statement than question. James paused, offering her a small, enigmatic smile. "Not yet," he replied, his composure unshaken. She shook her head, a flicker of amusement or perhaps disbelief crossing her face before she returned to her typing, the clatter of keys signaling the end of their exchange. Stepping into the cool March air, James felt the weight of Thompson's words settle over him like a heavy cloak. The sideways glances of the bank employees lingered in his mind, their hushed whispers trailing him like shadows, but he wouldn't let it break him. He knew who he was, knew the victories he'd clawed from the jaws of doubt, and as he walked away from the branch, a slow smile spread across his face. He pictured Thompson's expression when they met again, not as a supplicant, but as a shareholder with a voice that could no longer be ignored. The real test wouldn't be his own resilience, it would be the bank's ability to confront its own blindness. In his car, James closed his eyes for a moment, the hum of the engine a soothing counterpoint to the chaos of the day. He let the sting of humiliation fuel him, transforming it into a quiet, burning resolve. The shareholders' meeting loomed on the horizon, a stage where he would expose not just Thompson's prejudice, but the deeper rot within the bank's culture. As he drove away, he knew the board was unprepared for the lesson he was about to deliver, a lesson in justice, in the consequences of wielding power without accountability, and in the true worth of those they so carelessly dismissed. The conference room buzzed with an electric anticipation as Thompson, a weary man with slick-back hair and a tie knotted too tightly, leapt at the chance to take center stage. His movements were sharp, almost theatrical, as he strode to the front, clutching his notes like a lifeline. He was visibly eager, his eyes darting across the room, seeking approval from the sea of tailored suits and stern faces. As the presentation unfolded, he clicked through slides with the fervor of a man unveiling a masterpiece, each chart and statistic glowing on the screen like trophies polished to perfection in his mind. His voice boomed with enthusiasm, rattling off plans for the local branch risk management, customer service quality, profit margins, if every syllable cemented his worth. He stood taller with every nod from the audience, his chest puffing out, his ego swelling like a balloon ready to burst. Across the polished mahogany table, James Carter sat in stillness, a stark contrast to Thompson's frenetic energy. His hands rested folded atop one another, fingers interlaced with a quiet confidence that needed no fanfare. His eyes, steady and unblinking, followed Thompson's performance with a calm that bordered on unnerving. He listened as the man prattled on about maintaining standards. James knew all too well were hollow promises. Just days before, he'd stood in Thompson's branch, a customer dismissed with a sneer, his request brushed aside with the arrogance of someone who thought power was a birthright. The irony wasn't lost on James, and as Thompson wrapped up his speech with a flourish, basking in the polite applause that rippled through the room, James felt a flicker of something disappointed, perhaps tinged with resolve. Thompson concluded with a smug grin, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow as he soaked in the claps and murmurs of approval. He returned to his seat, oblivious to the storm brewing just across the table. The chatter died down, and James raised a hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of authority. The bank's president, a graying man with a lined face and a voice smoothed by years of diplomacy, caught the signal and nodded. "James Carter, please," he said, his tone warm, almost reverent. "You always bring something valuable to the table." The room turned, a collective breath held, as James rose slowly, deliberately, his presence filling the space without effort. Thompson, still riding the high of his moment, didn't flinch, didn't yet see the thread connecting the man he'd scorned to the figure, now commanding everyone's attention. James adjusted the microphone with a careful hand, the faint screech of feedback cutting through the silence before he spoke. "First, I'd like to commend Mr. Thompson on his presentation," he began, his voice smooth and sincere, carrying a warmth that disarmed the room. "It's obvious that managing risks and boosting profits are critical to our success as a bank." He paused, letting the compliment hang in the air, a gentle breeze before the gust. "But I'd like to share something personal, something that happened to me recently. At one of our branches." Thompson shifted in his seat, crossing his arms, his curiosity piqued, but his face still blank, untouched by recognition. James's gaze swept the room, steady and piercing, as he recounted his tale. He didn't name names, there was no need, but his words painted a vivid picture. He described stepping into the branch, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and printer ink, his shoes clicking against the linoleum floor as he approached the manager's desk. He spoke of presenting a request, one backed by years of financial stability, only to be met with a dismissive wave, a curled lip, a tone dripping with condescension. "I was treated as if I were an inconvenience," he said, his voice dipping low, heavy with the memory. "My situation was judged in haste, assumptions thrown out like facts. No effort made to understand the reality of what I brought to the table." The room grew still, the weight of his words settling like dust after a storm. What we claim to stand for as a bank, integrity, service, respect, was nowhere to be found that day. Thompson's face began to change, a slow flush creeping up his neck. his jaw tightening as the pieces clicked into place. His earlier confidence wavered, replaced by a flicker of unease he tried to mask with a stiff posture. Around the table, the other executives exchanged furtive glances, their eyes darting between James and Thompson, sensing the tension coiling tighter with every word. The president leaned forward, his hands clasped, his brow furrowed as he absorbed the story unfolding before him. James pressed on, unwavering. "We can't just rely on numbers and polished slides," he said, gesturing toward the projector screen still glowing with Thompson's charts. "We need to ask ourselves how we're training our people, how we're ensuring that every client, from the smallest account holder to the largest, walks out of our doors feeling valued. Because, in the end, it's not the profits that define us, it's how we treat those who trust us with their lives." By now, Thompson was sweating, beads glistening on his forehead as he squirmed in his seat. He cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to interject. "With all due respect, Mr. Carter, there might have been a misunderstanding. Our guidelines are strict for a reason, to protect the bank's interests." His words sounded feeble, a flimsy shield against the tide turning against him. James raised a hand, a gentle but firm interruption, his tone never losing its measured grace. "Mr. Thompson, guidelines matter, yes, but what we're talking about here isn't rules, it's culture. It's the heart of this institution. When that culture falters, when it breeds exclusion instead of service, we've lost our way." The president nodded, his expression grave yet thoughtful. "James has a point," he said, his voice cutting through the thick air. "We need to look hard at how we're running things, show we're instilling our values from the ground up. Maybe it's time to rethink our approach." James eased back into his chair, satisfied that his message had landed, while Thompson seemed to shrink, his bravado evaporating like mist under sunlight. His attempts to defend himself rang hollow, each excuse crumbling against the quiet power of James's truth. The meeting trudged on, but Thompson was barely there. His mind spun, replaying the moment he'd brushed off a man he now knew was James Carter, not just a customer, but a titan among the shareholders. The realization gnawed at him, his stomach twisting as he recalled the disdain he'd flung so carelessly. Across the room, James remained composed, flipping through papers with a serene focus, as if the confrontation had been a mere ripple in his day. But both men knew the air between them crackled with unfinished business. As the others filed out, their voices buzzing with post-meeting chatter, Thompson lingered, his fingers white-knuckled around the table's edge. The room emptied, leaving only the hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of papers. He took a shaky breath and approached James, who looked up with that same unflappable calm. "Mr. Carter," Thompson started, his voice trembling despite his effort to steady it. "I'd like to explain what happened, if I'd known who you were." James cut him off, raising a hand with a gentleness that only deepened Thompson's shame. "Mr. Thompson, it's not about who I am. That's the whole point. It's about how you treated Semyonenyo, who walked into your office asking for help." Thompson's mouth opened, then closed, words failing him as he stood exposed. Stripped of the armor he'd worn so proudly, he'd always been the one in control, the gatekeeper, the decider. Now, he felt small, vulnerable, a man caught in his own trap. "I get it, Mr. Carter," he managed at last, his voice quivering. "The bank has policies, procedures we have to follow, and those procedures are tools, not excuses." James interjected, his tone firm yet kind. "When they become a wall to hide behind, when they justify treating people like they don't matter, we've failed, not just our clients, but the very purpose of this place." Thompson felt each word like a hammer strike, a public reprimand veiled as wisdom. He ducked his head, the fight draining out of him. "I know I messed up," he admitted, barely above a whisper. "I didn't think it'd come out like this." James stood, sliding his papers into his briefcase with deliberate care. He met Thompson's eyes, and for a moment, the manager glimpsed something beyond the polished exterior, a man who understood power, not as a weapon, but as a responsibility. "This isn't about airing mistakes," James said, his voice softening. "It's about growing from them. We're all here to get better, but that starts with owning where we've gone wrong." Thompson nodded, a small, burdened gesture, knowing there was no quick escape from the mess he'd made. This wasn't just about saving Faceit, it was about facing himself. "I don't know if I can fix this," Thompson said, his voice cracking, raw with a vulnerability he'd never shown before. "But I want to try." James offered a faint smile, a glimmer of hope in the storm. "It's never too late to do what's right," he replied. "The key is that it comes from inside a real desire to be better." With that, he turned and left, leaving Thompson alone with his thoughts, a tempest of regret and possibility swirling in his mind. In the days that followed, the bank rolled out changes, new training on empathy and inclusion, policies to ensure every client's voice was heard. Thompson faced scrutiny, his role teetering on the edge, but beneath the pressure, he felt a spark. This wasn't just about salvaging his career, it was about rebuilding who he could be. James had wielded his influence not for vengeance, but for justice, a lesson in the consequences of power misused. And in that, Thompson saw a chance not just to atone, but to rise anew. In the quiet corridors of power, Word toiled tirelessly, weaving his influence like a skilled craftsman shaping a delicate piece of art. He understood that promises alone were hollow, mere whispers in the wind unless paired with action. Change, he knew, was a slow beast, lumbering forward only with persistent effort. Yet, he carried an unshakable resolve to see it through, his mind fixed on a vision of something better, something enduring. Far from the spotlight, his steady hand nudged the gears of progress, ensuring that every commitment took root and blossomed into tangible results. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was his calling, a quiet mission to reshape a world too often resistant to transformation. Meanwhile, Thompson's world had crumbled in a way he'd never anticipated. Once a man perched confidently atop the managerial ladder, he now faced the bitter sting of a demotion. The performance review had been brutal, a mirror held up to his flaws that he couldn't ignore. His title stripped away, he wasn't cast out, thanks to a rare moment of mercy from James, who stepped in with a request that surprised even himself. James didn't argue for Thompson's worthiness. Rather, he saw a flicker of potential beneath the wreckage, a chance for redemption. Not because Thompson had earned it, but because James clung to a belief that second chances could carve paths to renewal. So, Thompson landed in a quieter role, one stripped of prestige but heavy with opportunity. Each day, as he adjusted to his new reality, he felt the weight of his past arrogance pressing against his chest. The man who once strode through the branch with an air of untouchability now walked softer, his eyes tracing the floor as he pondered the lessons of humility. Weeks later, their paths crossed again, this time at a training event the bank had orchestrated to breathe life into its freshly minted values. The room buzzed with nervous energy. Employees shuffled in their seats, the air thick with the scent of coffee and the faint hum of overhead lights. James stood near the back, his presence subtle but commanding, watching as Thompson approached him. There was no trace of the old bravado in Thompson's step. Instead, his shoulders slumped slightly, his face softened by a sincerity James hadn't seen before. "I want to thank you," Thompson said, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "Not just for the job, but for giving me a chance to be better." His eyes met James's, unguarded and searching, as if he were still piecing together the man he'd become. James extended his hand, his grip firm yet warm, a silent acknowledgement of the shift. "That's true leadership, Mr. Thompson," he replied, his tone carrying the weight of conviction. "It's about recognizing we can grow and having the guts to take that first step." The branch itself seemed to exhale, shedding its old skin of bias and hasty judgments. Once a cold fortress of routine, it now pulsed with a tentative new rhythm. Employees, their ears tuned to the mandates of inclusion, greeted each customer with a care that felt almost foreign at first. For Thompson, the shift was visceral. Standing behind the counter in his diminished role, he watched a woman leave with a smile he'd helped coax into existence with a kind word and a listening ear. It struck him like a thunderclap. His actions, his words, they mattered. They rippled outward, touching lives in ways he'd never bothered to notice before. The realization settled into his bones, heavy but strangely liberating. James, observing from a distance, felt a quiet swell of fulfillment tempered by humility. He hadn't just unearthed a flawed manager or secured a fleeting win. He'd ignited something deeper, a spark of change that could, with time, engulfed the entire institution. As he stepped outside after the training, the sun caught the bank's facade, its name gleaming against the weathered stone. He paused, a faint smile tugging at his lips. This was a small battle in a larger war, he knew. But even the grandest revolutions began with modest acts. The air felt crisp against his skin, carrying the promise of more to come. Inside, the transformation unfurled in subtle, everyday moments. Customers who once shuffled through with lowered expectations now lingered, their faces brightening as tellers met them with genuine warmth. The new guidelines respect, inclusion weren't just words on a memo. They were taking root, sprouting in the smallest interactions. James watched it unfold with a quiet satisfaction, his heart lifting with each step forward. Thompson, meanwhile, threw himself into his new role with a fervor that surprised even him. Gone was the man who'd dismissed others with a flick of his wrist. In his place stood someone determined to learn, to atone. Yet, not everyone welcomed his change. Some colleagues still shot him sidelong glances, their eyes narrowing with distrust. To them, he remained a cautionary Talia relic of what happened when power was wielded without care. The conference room where he'd once barked orders now loomed in his memory, smaller and dimmer, a ghost of his former self. Shame clung to him like damp cloth, but he squared his shoulders against it, resolved to prove he could rise anew. James preferred to let his deeds speak, steering clear of grand pronouncements. In a meeting with the board, he leaned forward in his chair, the polished table reflecting the stern lines of his face. "What if we started a mentoring program?" he suggested, his voice calm but insistent. "Pair the seasoned staff with newcomers not just to teach the job, but to show them why equality matters." The idea landed like a stone in still water, ripples of approval spreading across the room. The board nodded, and soon James found himself at the helm of the initiative, a role he accepted with quiet pride. His visits to the branch grew more frequent to hover over Thompson, but to witness the culture taking shape. One afternoon, he stood near the teller line, his arms crossed casually, watching as Thompson guided a young employee. The boy, barely out of his teens, had fumbled a customer's request, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. Thompson's voice, once sharp as a blade, now carried a gentle patience. "Listen first," he said, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Hear what they need before you decide what to do." The teller nodded, gratitude flashing in his eyes, and James felt a flicker of something like pride. This was not the Thompson he'd known. Later, as the young teller returned to his station, James approached. Thompson turned, catching sight of him, and a shy smile broke across his facious smile, tinged with nerves he couldn't quite hide. "Didn't expect you here today, Mr. Carter," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're trying to do things differently." James tilted his head, his gaze steady. "I can see that. Mr. Thompson, you're doing well. Change isn't easy, but it's possible." They spoke briefly about the mentoring program, and James noted the shift in Thompson's demeanor, less guarded, more open, as if the armor of pride he'd once worn had begun to crack, letting light seep through. Then, after a pause, Thompson took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "Mr. Carter, I'd like to apologize again," he said, the words tumbling out like stones he'd carried too long. "I know I've said it before, but every day I see more of what I did wrong." James listened, his expression softening. This wasn't the rehearsed apology of weeks past. It was raw, real, born from a man finally grasping the depth of his missteps. "I accept it, Mr. Thompson," James replied, his smile genuine. "What matters is your learning. That's the heart of it." As they parted, James lingered, his eyes sweeping the branch. Every conversation, every small adjustment, it was weaving a new fabric, one stronger than the last. Thompson returned to his work, his posture looser, a man unburdened by the need to prove himself at every turn. James watched from afar, a quiet contentment settling over him. Weeks later, the bank threw open its doors for a community event, a vibrant affair meant to cement its pledge to inclusion. The parking lot buzzed with activitables laden with food, children darting between games, employees mingling with customers under a sky streaked with gold. Thompson hesitated at first, his old instincts urging him to retreat, but he pushed forward, rolling up his sleeves to help. He even led a workshop on empathy, his voice steady as he spoke to a small crowd about seeing through others' eyes. James took the stage briefly, his words simple but piercing. "Change doesn't stop," he said, the crowd hushing to hear him. "It's in the mistakes we own and the steps we take after." Applause erupted, warm and full, and James stepped back, feeling the weight of hope take root. Thompson approached him afterward, his eyes bright with a purpose James hadn't seen before. "I never thought I'd be here, part of this," he said, gesturing to the bustling scene. "But now I know this is where I belong." James clasped his hand, feeling the earnestness in the grip. "The path's rough, but every step forward counts," he said. "Keep going, even when you stumble." The event stretched into the evening, laughter and chatter filling the air, and James left with a lightness he hadn't felt in months. The branch, once a battleground, now stood as a quiet triumph, a testament to resilience, to justice prevailing over unchecked power. Months rolled on, and the changes deepened. New policies lifted morale. Training sessions fostered collaboration, and the branch hummed with a warmth that drew people in. Thompson emerged as a mentor, his journey a beacon for others. One day, James sat across from the bank's president at a lunch table adorned with crisp linens and gleaming glassware. The man raised his glass, his voice booming with praise. "James, your vision pulled us through. We'd be lost without it." James smiled, deflecting gently. "It's the team, sir. They made it real." Thompson's name came up too, his turnaround a story that surprised even the president. "He's proof change can stick," the man said, and James nodded. Knowing it was a victory for more than just one man, it was a lesson in accountability, in the cost of hubris. On his final visit to the branch, James walked into smiles and a handshake from the receptionist, a young woman whose welcome carried none of the old chill. The new manager, a sharp-eyed idealist, brimmed with energy, and Thompson, a regional trainer, stood in a corner, guiding a cluster of staff with a quiet confidence. "Mr. Carter," he said, striding over, "we're moving forward because of you." James shook his head. "I just lit the match, Mr. Thompson. You all kept the fire going." As he left, customers chatted happily in the lobby. There is a silent hymn to the branch's rebirth. Driving away, James glanced back at the building, its facade glowing in the dusk. It wasn't just a bank anymore, it was a marker of what could be, a reminder that justice, wielded with patience and purpose, could topple even the tallest towers of pride. And with that, he turned toward the horizon, ready for whatever came next.